Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, into a world where you survive not with solar panels or freeze-dried chilies packs, but with animal bladders, firewood math, and a stubborn, dirty sort of brilliance. This isn't a reenactment with costume changes and cosplay smiles. This is real medieval survival, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I'm always curious who else is out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch by a low-burning fire that barely keeps the autumn mist off your face. The air smells of wet leaves, wool smoke, and the raw, pungent funk of animal hide. In front of you, a bulging goatskin sack, tied tight at the mouth, hangs from a forked stick over the embers. It gurgles, bulges, and sizzles gently. Inside, water, not for storage, for boiling. You're cooking in a literal leather bag. See, pots were expensive. Ironwork was a trade, and not everyone had access to a blacksmith, let alone coin to buy a cauldron. So when you needed to purify water or simmer roots into something your teeth could manage, you worked with what you had, and what you had was usually dead animals, or at least parts of them. The trick was in controlling the fire. Too hot and the hide would scorch, burst, or leak. But with careful embers, no direct flame, you could bring the water just hot enough to boil. It's not elegant, but it works. Steam rises, bubbles churn, and with the water now safe-ish to drink, you sit back and wait for it to cool, half watching the tree line, half daydreaming about a life where mugs had handles and nobody bled from splinters. You dip a hollowed-out horn into the water. No mug, no ladle, just whatever curved scrap you've shaved into something scoopable. The leather has flavoured the water, musky, slightly salty, but it's warm and alive in your belly. Better than dysentery, which, fun fact, was less a danger and more a seasonal expectation back then. Still, the boiling hide bag isn't the weirdest thing you've used today. Earlier, you tried to start a fire with flint and steel. Took forever. Your fingers are still raw. But you managed. You're learning. Slowly, painfully. Around you, the forest whispers with autumn. Dry leaves hiss against each other. An owl calls. Distant and unconcerned. And you keep checking your water bag, now sagging and steaming less. You made it. Clean water. No bleach tablets, no UV straw, no plastic jug. Just you, a goat's skin, and a growing ability to outstubborn the elements. Here's a wild little sidebar. Some medieval folks didn't even boil water. Not because they didn't know better, but because in some areas, they just drank low-alcohol ale instead. Brewing small beer, low in booze, high in safety, was often easier than trusting your stream not to give you worms. So even kids drank beer, just not the kind you're picturing. But back to you. You've been living off the land for a few days now, and you're beginning to feel it. Your shoulders ache, your stomach's doing suspicious things, and you're starting to realize why people didn't just survive the medieval world, they endured it. Boiling water in a leather pouch may sound crude, but in reality it's one of those forgotten workarounds modern preppers tend to overlook. Everyone talks about metal pots, titanium mugs, or those nesting camping sets that cost more than your rent. But what if you had none of it? What if you had just nature, a knife, and something freshly skinned? It's also one of those things that archaeologists debate over. Some argue it was common in nomadic societies. Scots, Mongols, Sami people, who didn't carry much. Others say boiling in skin was rare, inefficient, a last resort. But then again, what part of medieval survival wasn't? You run your hand over the soft inner wall of the hide pouch, still warm, still holding. You wonder how many times you can reuse it before it tears, and how long before you have to skin something else. The idea doesn't thrill you. But you're learning, right? Learning to adapt. Learning to stop expecting comfort and start appreciating the raw genius of improvisation. And speaking of genius, here's something else. The water might be clean now, but without salt your body's still going to betray you. Salt's not just for flavour. It keeps your cells from shrivelling, your muscles from cramping, and your brain from getting loopy. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you've got warmth, a cup of slightly furry water, and a fire that, if you keep feeding it just right, might last until morning. You're not comfortable, but you're surviving. And for now, that's enough. Your breath ghosts out in front of you in the dim morning light, curling above the ashes of last night's fire. Your joints crack as you rise, stiff from sleeping on half-dried moss and twigs, but your stomach demands attention before your spine can register a complaint. You walk toward the shallow pit you dug the day before, your root cache. No, not potatoes, not even carrots. You pull out a half-dozen dirty turnips, each knobby and lopsided like they were grown more out of spite than care. Because here's the thing, if you're stuck in medieval survival mode, you better make peace with the fact that your diet is going to look more like livestock feed than a backyard bibby. Turnips were everywhere in medieval Europe, especially in the colder northern regions. Hardy, fast-growing and indifferent to poor soil, they were the backbone of peasant food culture long before the sexy crops, like tomatoes, potatoes, and corn hit the scene from the Americas. Your modern pantry is basically a Columbian exchange cheat code, but back then, turnips, lots of them. And if it wasn't turnips, it was barley gruel, cabbage stew, or onions so strong they could kill friendships. You scrape the dirt off the largest one and take a bite. It's raw, a little woody, and tastes like spicy dirt with an attitude problem. Not good exactly, but edible. Kind of like how a wet sock is wearable if you're desperate enough. A few more bites and your jaw's already tired. This thing fights back. Nearby, you've been drying out a few broadleaf plants and nettles, planning to toss them in a soup later if you can gather enough water again. Maybe even roast some acorns if you can leach the bitterness out. But your options are severely limited. There's no supermarket, no vending machine, and more importantly, no New World crops. No maize, no beans, except fava, no squash, and definitely no tomatoes. That's a huge historical blind spot for a lot of modern preppers. Everyone's hoarding tomato seeds like they'll still grow in every region when things go south. But you're stuck trying to love root vegetables that look like tumours and taste like bland revenge. The turnip is your new best friend, and your worst enemy at the same time. By midday, you've boiled the rest of your turnips into a kind of stew. Calling it stew is generous. It's more like hot root mush. But as you stir the mix with a carved stick and sprinkle in a few crushed nettle leaves, you realise that flavour was a luxury. Calories were king, and whatever you could chew and not die from, you ate. You even catch yourself eyeing a snail crawling across a nearby rock, remembering what you read about peasants boiling them into broth. Interestingly, medieval peasants didn't always eat what they grew. A lot of the best stuff, wheat, livestock, fruit, was earmarked for taxes or lords. What remained was the bitter, stringy or frost-resistant filler. Parsnips, kale, leeks, and of course turnips. You learn fast that survival wasn't about eating well, it was about eating at all. You stretch out on your back while the pot simmers, watching clouds drift in the grey sky. There's a smell of damp earth and boiled root in the air. Nothing sweet, nothing fried. Your body is already starting to crave fat and salt, even as your belly stops growling. You're starting to see how famines weren't always sudden. Sometimes they crept in behind seasons, slowly dulling people into a kind of grey hunger. You could eat every day and still starve, just more politely. A fringe fact for you while your stew cools. Medieval people sometimes carved turnips into lanterns for festivals. Yes, before pumpkins got all the Halloween glory. It was mostly in Celtic traditions, where they'd hollow out a big gnarly root and stick a candle inside. Frankly terrifying. Makes you wonder if the devil would actually be scared of that thing or just confused. And as you chew your way through another bowl of beige paste, you start wondering how anyone stayed healthy at all. Here's the scholarly debate of the night. Did medieval peasants suffer chronic malnutrition, or were they surprisingly resilient? Some historians argue their diets, though dull, were often rich in seasonal greens, wild herbs, and fermented foods. Others suggest skeletal remains from rural areas show widespread signs of anemia, stunted growth and arthritis. The truth? Probably somewhere in the mud between. By evening, you've fashioned a crude drying rack out of forked sticks and laid out more wild greens to preserve for later. You eye a few dandelion leaves you picked earlier, trying to remember whether you read somewhere they help with digestion or just taste like bitter sadness. Either way, they're going into tomorrow's soup. Or maybe you'll try roasting them, you're feeling bold. As the fire crackles low again, you wrap the rest of your boiled turnips in a scrap of hide and tuck it into your cloak. Maybe tomorrow you'll try to trap a rabbit. Or find more acorns. Or maybe just start calling yourself Lord of the Root People and embrace the tuber-based lifestyle. But tonight, you're full enough to sleep. You have a little clean water, some warm mush in your gut, and a vague, gnawing sense of historical injustice about the global dominance of the tomato. You smile despite yourself. Rain woke you before the sun did, slow at first, then a steady trickle that drummed across your makeshift shelter like drips into an empty bucket. You roll onto your side wrapped in a damp wool cloak that smells a little too strongly of the sheep it once belonged to, and peek out at the sky, grey, featureless, the kind of sky that forgets to stop raining. Your shelter's holding, sort of. It's nothing impressive, just a hut really, more of a lump. A slouching triangle of sticks, moss and grass, smeared with mud and pressed together like a drunk cake. But the roof? It's alive, literally. Sod laid over woven sticks, anchored with turf, moss and anything else you could pile up there without it caving in. It's heavy but solid. Medieval people knew how to build with the earth, not just on it. You crawl out, brushing wet grass from your face, and take a moment to admire your handiwork. It looks like something a badger would live in, maybe an angry one. But you've slept dry 2 nights in a row now, and that's a miracle by any pre-industrial standard. That, and your walls haven't collapsed, which is more than you can say for the first attempt. See, building a shelter in medieval fashion doesn't mean throwing up a log cabin or hammering nails. Nails were precious, metal of any kind was expensive. Most houses were a mix of wattle, woven sticks, and daub, mud, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. Basically, the medieval version of papier-mâché if your paper was dirt and your glue smelled worse. Add a turf roof, and you've got yourself a structure that stays cool in summer, warmish in winter, and surprisingly cosy, if you don't mind the occasional mouse popping out of your ceiling. You take a walk around your tiny camp, noting where the rain is pooling. You'll need to dig a little drainage ditch soon. Not glamorous, but essential. Medieval peasants knew water was as much an enemy as it was a lifeline. Too little, and you starved. Too much, and your home turned into a swampy soup bowl. Flooded huts, rotting floors, mouldy straw beds. These were everyday problems. You kneel by a section of your hut's outer wall and press your hand to the mud. It's damp, but not cracking. That's a good sign. Your daub mixture included crushed grass and even a little ash. Both help bind it and discourage insects. You even remembered to pack it between the sticks with your hands, not a stick, pressing and smearing in layers until it felt solid. And that's something a lot of modern survivalists forget. You don't build medieval shelters fast, do you? You build them right. And here's a fun fact to chew on while you work. The thatched roof, often ridiculed as primitive, was a masterpiece of insulation. Straw, when properly packed and tied, sheds rain for decades. The trick was in the layering, the pitch, and the maintenance. A well-thatched roof wasn't a mark of poverty. It was a badge of craftsmanship. And in some parts of England and Scandinavia, they're still using the thatch today, not out of nostalgia, but because it works. You pause, looking at the edge of your roof where some of the turf has slumped in the rain. That's the thing about these old methods. They demand upkeep. You're not just building shelter, you're entering a relationship with it. It sags, it leaks, it shifts, and you adapt. A far cry from modern preppers who imagine bunkers sealed tight and permanent. Medieval survival was alive, in the literal sense. Every structure you built breathed, settled, and decayed. Back inside, the smell of damp wool and smoked fat lingers. You keep your dried nettles stored in a pouch near the fire pit, along with some resin and birch bark you're hoping to turn into waterproofing tar later this week. Everything in here has a place, even if that place is the corner you shoved it into last night while cursing the rain. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not the only one building sod-roofed shelters in the wild. The tradition spans centuries and continents. From Viking turf houses in Iceland to Highland crofter huts in Scotland to Mongolian earth lodges, these weren't just for the poor, they were intelligent, resource-efficient responses to local climates. The modern world would call it green architecture and charge 6 figures for it. Back then it was just Tuesday. Still, not everyone agrees on the exact techniques. Archaeologists debate how much wattle and daub was used versus timber frame, especially in colder regions. Some think most peasant homes were little more than seasonal shacks, while others argue they were surprisingly sophisticated. Recent digs have even uncovered evidence of lime-plastered interiors, actual interior finishing work, in what were assumed to be mud huts. The medieval world keeps throwing curveballs like that. Your stomach growls again. You dig into your root pouch and gnaw on a cold turnip chunk, still vaguely warm from your body heat. It's not glamorous, but your shelter keeps the wind off, and you're sitting dry while the rain plays its lazy rhythm outside. Later you'll patch the roof. Maybe reinforce the doorway with a few extra woven panels. You'll line the floor with fresh reeds if you can find some. And maybe, just maybe, you'll figure out how to make this place feel like something more than a dirt-walled coffin with dreams. But for now, it's shelter. It's yours, and it's holding together better than you are. The sky finally breaks open around midday, and a reluctant beam of pale sun slips through the trees. You take it as a sign it's time to move to work. You're almost out of fuel. The fire's been generous, but it won't feed itself, and you can already feel the cold sharpening its teeth for tonight. You grab your small axe, a battered wedge of iron strapped to a rough wooden handle, and head toward the edge of the clearing where the birch and hazel grow thick. You're not looking to fell a tree. That's the rookie mistake. Full-grown trees are a pain to process and harder to move without beasts or a buddy. And besides, medieval people didn't just cut down forests like it was nothing. They practiced something way smarter: coppicing. You may not have heard of it, but you're about to get real familiar with this ancient, renewable, and strangely elegant survival hack. Coppicing is the art of cutting trees down to help them live longer. Sounds backwards, right? But here's how it works. You find a species that responds well to being cut, like hazel, ash or willow, and you chop it near the base. The stump or stool doesn't die. Instead, it sends out shoots. Straight, fast-growing poles, perfect to go out for firewood, fencing or even construction. And those shoots, you harvest them every few years, and the tree keeps giving decade after decade. It's the medieval version of a sustainable wood subscription service. You stop in front of a clump of hazel and test the bend of one slender pole. About wrist thick, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Perfect. A few well-placed swings and it comes down with a snap, the leaves fluttering like paper. You bundle it with a few others and stack them to dry. Even now, the scent of green wood is sweet and sappy in your nose, comforting in a feral sort of way. This is one of those techniques modern preppers rarely talk about. Everyone's all about fire starter hacks and magnesium strikers, but no one wants to talk about long-term fuel management. Because you're not just surviving for a weekend here, you're trying to last through seasons, maybe years. And if you think you're going to rely on scavenged deadwood forever, good luck when the snow comes and everything is soaked and frozen solid. Coppicing isn't just smart, it's essential. You drag your bundle back toward camp and start sorting it into piles. Thin poles for kindling, thicker ones for the fire pit, a few especially straight ones for repairs, maybe even a fence or trap later. The medieval peasant wasn't a lumberjack, they were a manager of living resources. Coppicing was often done on a cycle, with different sections of woodland harvested in turn. They knew their forest like you know your fridge, what was ready, what needed more time, what was spoiling, what had potential. You build a crude lean-to rack from older poles and lash them together with strips of rawhide and twisted nettle cord. Then you lay the hazel sticks on top to season. Dry wood burns better. Wet wood just makes smoke and attention, which is the last thing you want if you're trying to keep your camp quiet. Speaking of which, here's a little-known fact. Some charcoal burners, yes, that was a real medieval job, would live alone in the woods for weeks, tending hidden piles of smouldering wood just to make high-quality charcoal. They were ghost people, often feared or shunned, with blackened faces and reputations for being a little off. And considering you're halfway there yourself, living in a moss hut and talking to your fire, you're starting to get it. Later in the day, with your woodstock sorted and your shelter reinforced, you finally get around to the more delicate part of fire maintenance, preserving embers. Matches don't exist here. Lighters? Batteries? Forget it. You're dealing with tinder bundles, flint and steel. And if you're lucky, yesterday's coals buried in ash. That's why you bank your fire, piling ash over glowing coals to keep them insulated and alive overnight. It's a game of timing, airflow and superstition. Screw it up and you're back to striking sparks in the dark, praying to whatever gods like pyromaniacs. There's even debate among historians about just how good medieval people were at starting fires from scratch. Some think it was a rare skill reserved for specialists. Others believe every household knew the basics, if only because keeping a fire going indefinitely just wasn't always realistic. What's certain is this: fire was life, and the fuel you fed it determined how warm, how fed and how safe you stayed. The sun is dipping low now, orange and fat behind the trees. The light catches your pile of hazel like polished bone. A hard day's labour, sure, but you feel a strange pride knowing that in 6 months, those same sticks might still be burning in your hearth, or bent into the ribs of a new shelter. It's a long game, this kind of survival. Less apocalypse fantasy, more muddy hands and aching shoulders. You feed a few dry splinters into the fire and sit back on a stone, cloak drawn around your knees. You're not just surviving, You're practicing an old, weird kind of forestry that most people with YouTube bug-out channels have never even heard of. You're learning not to take from the land, but to cooperate with it. The fire snaps and hisses, a perfect pole crackles, releasing its stored sunlight one flicker at a time. You lean back, head resting against the mud wall of your hut, and stare at the stars peeking through the canopy. Tomorrow, you'll check on that stand of young ash trees to the south. Maybe mark a few for next year. Maybe you'll build a proper gate for your shelter, or a drying rack for meat, if you ever manage to catch any. But tonight, you're content. Your fire is fed, your roof is holding. And your hands smell like sap and smoke, proof you're doing this the old way, the real way, the forgotten way. You wake up coughing. The fire burned down sometime after midnight, leaving behind a lazy swirl of smoke curling up from the coals. Your throat's dry, your nose stings, and the air inside your hut smells like a wool blanket left too close to a barbecue. It takes a minute before your brain reminds you why everything reeks like that. You were burning scraps from your first charcoal pit. That's right, you tried it. Dug a pit, filled it with wood, packed it down with turf and dirt, and lit the whole thing from the bottom like a slow-motion bonfire. You cough again, this time laughing, because your eyes still burn a little, and your fingernails are stained with soot. But here's the good news. The pit worked. Or mostly worked. There's a pile of half-charred wood you'll have to sift through later, but tucked beneath the top layer is a pocket of beautiful blackened lumps, medieval gold, real homegrown charcoal. And not just for heating, this stuff was the foundation of almost every serious fire-based task in the Middle Ages, from blacksmithing to bread ovens. You step outside, blinking against the weak morning sun. The pit is still warm, steaming gently. It looks like a grave someone forgot to finish burying, a sunken patch of scorched earth with a rough stone cap. Not glamorous, but effective. Making charcoal this way, slow burning in a low-oxygen environment, isn't something modern folks stumble across often, unless they're really deep into off-grid living or Renaissance fairs with chemistry side quests. In medieval Europe, charcoal wasn't a side hustle. It was the main act. Every smith, baker, brewer and brewer's cousin needed it. It burned hotter and cleaner than raw wood, essential for forges, kilns and preserving food. And unlike today, where you just buy a bag of briquettes from a gas station, back then you had to make it. Carefully. Secretly sometimes. Because yes, charcoal burners were known for their secrecy and weird solitary lives. It wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. Or a curse, depending on who you ask. You crouch by the edge of your pit and break off a chunk of your newly forged charcoal. It's light, almost suspiciously so, and it crumbles under your fingers like burned paper. Perfect. You run your thumb along its edge, leaving a slick smear of black on your skin. This is fuel. High-grade, old-school fuel. And more than that, it's a survival edge that most modern preppers ignore entirely. Everyone's into solar panels and hand-crank generators, but if you're trying to cook food, purify water, and not die of hypothermia, charcoal is the move. It stores well, burns hot, and can even be used for rudimentary filtration. Plus, if you know what you're doing, you can make it anywhere there's wood and a little patience. Or, in your case, a week of trial and error, a lot of smoke in the face and one minor burn on your forearm. You collect a few of the cleaner lumps and store them in a bark-lined basket you made from a peeled birch trunk. It's not pretty, but it holds. You're getting better at this, at making things instead of just using them. Charcoal, like most medieval techniques, isn't about convenience, it's about resourcefulness. By late morning, you're building up your main fire again, this time with a base of charcoal. The heat difference is immediate. Where dry wood crackles and flares, charcoal burns low and steady, a glowing bed of coals that radiates warmth like an ancient engine. You can feel it in your bones. It's the kind of fire you could cook a proper meal over. If you had anything better than boiled weeds and root chunks, still you toss a few dry leaves into a clay pot with some nettles and your last sliver of dried meat. It's a sad stew, but it smells good in the rising warmth of your hut. Outside, the pit steams like a dragon's nostril, and the air hums with the faint hiss of slow combustion. You did it. You joined the long, soot-covered lineage of charcoal makers stretching back thousands of years, and not without risk. That's the part people forget. Charcoal pits can go so fast. If the fire gets too much oxygen, it turns into a full blaze and eats your fuel. If you seal it too tightly, the fire chokes out. There's an art to it, one modern stoves and fire logs don't prepare you for. That's why even now there's scholarly debate over just how widespread personal charcoal pits were. Some argue they were limited to craftsmen and rural industries. Others think every village had at least one smouldering heap tucked away behind the fields. You're starting to believe the latter. The sun crawls higher, casting long shadows through the trees. You drag a few more logs toward a second pit you're planning, this time experimenting with a cone method, stacked upright, covered in turf and dirt, burned from a central shaft, just to see which works better. You're not just surviving now, you're refining. Later, as the light fades and the fire burns low, you stretch your legs near the glowing coals and feel a deep, smoky satisfaction. It's not comfort exactly. You're still hungry, still filthy, and you think there's a tick somewhere in your sock. But it's control. You took raw forest and turned it into heat, light, and power. No help, no gadgets, just fire, dirt, and stubbornness. You lean back against your hut and watch the sparks drift upward, little embers catching on the breeze. One of them might be floating towards someone else, another ghost in the woods, trying to remember how people used to live before the world got complicated. You smile in the dark, charcoal-streaked and sore. You're not a survivalist. Not really. You're something older. You don't notice how badly you smell until the wind changes. One shift in the breeze and there it is. The ripe scent of smoke, sweat, damp wool, and something far worse. Old fat. The kind that coats everything in a sticky, waxy funk and never quite comes out of your clothes. That's when you remember it's your rushlight. Last night you lit your shelter with one. A simple little thing, a dried reed or the twisted plant stalk dipped in tallow and left to harden. It gave off just enough light to see by, and just enough smoke to nearly choke on. Primitive? Absolutely. But it worked. And you're going to make more of them, because unless you enjoy stubbing your toe on everything you own, you're going to need light after sunset. Rushlights are one of those beautiful lost arts of medieval life. Cheap, ugly, and completely functional. You're not dealing with fancy candles here. Those were for the church, or maybe the manor house if the lord was feeling decadent. Regular folk, your new medieval self included, relied on whatever was at hand, and that meant hollow rushes soaked in the leftover grease from cooking or butchering. Not beeswax, not oil from olives or whales, just animal fat and dried swamp plants. This morning, after a bit of poking around in the soggy field near your camp, you find a patch of tall rushes, green, spongy stalks rising from the muck. You cut a bundle with your belt knife and haul them back to camp, where the sun finally decides to show up and help you dry them out. Then comes the stripping, pulling off the green outer skin to get at the pithy white centre. The stuff light's easy, burns fast, and if you dip it right, can keep a small flame alive for maybe half an hour. Not impressive by modern standards, but enough to get through dinner or stare blankly at your wall until sleep takes over. You set a few of the stripped rushes beside your fire, watching them slowly stiffen as they dry. Meanwhile, you pull out your stash of tallow, a small pot of congealed grey-white animal fat you rendered after a lucky snare catch last week. It smells like, well, death, mixed with smoke, and something faintly sweet, which is probably worse, but this is medieval life, not a spa weekend. You melt the tallow near the coals, dip the rushes, and lay them out on a flat stone to cool. Soon you've got a handful of serviceable rushlights, some short, some long, all slightly grotesque. You jam one into a split stick to stand it up and light it with a coal. It flares, sputters, then steadies into a wavering orange glow. Shadows leap across the walls of your hut. The air fills with the smell of burning fat and scorched plant fibre, which is, if you can believe it, actually better than your usual smoky atmosphere. But let's be honest, this thing is barely a candle. The light is dim, inconsistent, and smoky. It drips, it leans, sometimes it just fizzles out for no reason. And yet, there's something weirdly satisfying about it. You made light from nothing. You didn't flip a switch, charge a battery, or burn a perfectly good flashlight bulb. You used fat and grass. You're one witch's hat away from full druid status at this point. Here's a quirky side note for your smoke-soaked brain to chew on. In some medieval households, rushlights were mounted in special holders that allowed you to adjust the angle, because the more upright the rush, the slower it burned. Peasants had a science to this stuff. They could time their nightly chores by how much rush was left, and they got really good at stretching them for maximum glow with minimal stink. Some even double-dipped them for longer burn time, layering fat like a medieval candle hack. Of course, there's debate about how widely these rushlights were used. Some historians argue they were strictly a British Isles Gators phenomenon, common in Ireland, Wales and northern England. Others think versions of it popped up across Europe wherever reeds grew and beeswax didn't. What's not up for debate is this. If you didn't have money, you didn't have light. You had rushlights, firelight and moonlight, if you were lucky. And forget glass windows. Your hut has none, just a hole in the wall stuffed with bundled grass when the weather turns. Back inside, your hut glows with the flickering amber light. It makes everything look haunted, a bit ancient, a bit unreal. You stare at the walls, tracing the lines where the mud has dried and cracked. And you wonder what medieval people thought of the dark. Not just the physical dark, but the emotional one. The endless nights, the silence, the creaking trees, the way every sound gets magnified tenfold when the sun goes down. You feel it creeping in now, the weight of darkness pressing against your little bubble of flame. The rushlight dances, guttering slightly as a draught sneaks through the doorframe. You place a few hot stones near the coals to hold some warmth overnight, and then wedge another rushlight between two rocks by your bed. The fat drips in slow, glistening drops. You stare at it, half hypnotized. Fire is life, light is survival, and in this world, it's also fragile. Before you lay down for the night, you prep a few more rushes just in case. You don't know how long this storm will last or when you'll be able to harvest again. Everything here is labour. Every convenience is now a task. Want light? Make it. Want heat? Chop it. Want to sleep warm? Start preparing at noon. As the last rushlight burns low and your shelter slips back into shadow, you realise something simple and slightly uncomfortable. You're doing okay. Not thriving by any modern standard, but you're still here, still dry, still warm. And tonight, your ceiling glowed with firelight because you remembered a trick that most of the world forgot. And somehow, that's enough. The wind picks up before dawn, moaning low through the trees like the woods are trying to tell you something in a language you've forgotten how to understand. Your hut groans a little too, the sod roof shifting slightly under the pressure. You lie still, listening to the world breathe around you, layered in wool and moss and the strange new stillness of someone who's starting to become part of their environment instead of fighting it. Today's a fuel day, not firewood. Firewood's temporary. Today you're thinking long-term, years, not weeks. You want heat, tools, fencing, shelter, forever. Which means heading back to that small clearing of hazel and ash you marked a few days ago. But this time you're not harvesting, you're managing. Coppicing was step one, cutting trees near the base so they grow back in a predictable, harvestable cycle. But today you're diving deeper into its cousin, pollarding. Where coppicing is ground-level cutting, pollarding happens higher up, around shoulder height or more. Why? To keep new shoots away from grazing animals. Goats, cows, deer, they'll eat anything green within reach. But if the regrowth starts high, it survives. You keep your firewood, and the animals don't get free salad. It's basically medieval silviculture meets livestock management. You reach the grove and look up. Several trees already show the signs. Bushy tops where straighter poles have sprouted from old cuts. Some of them are decades into their cycle. Others look younger, freshly pollarded, still healing. You choose a few smaller ash trees, about as thick as your wrist, and give them space. This isn't about grabbing all you can, it's a relationship. You cut, they grow, you wait, they provide. And here's the medieval brilliance. These techniques, pollarding and coppicing, never kill the tree. Instead, they reset its growth clock. Some pollarded trees have lived for hundreds of years because of this. In fact, they outlive untouched trees. No rot from the inside, no stressed fractures from tall, top-heavy growth. Just consistent, healthy regrowth. A peasant's insurance policy, paid out in kindling, fencing poles, and maybe even timber if you're patient enough. You walk the grove, gently scoring bark on a few candidates with your knife. A subtle reminder to come back next season and cut. You tie strips of rush around others, marking their age. Suddenly, you're not just surviving in the woods anymore. You're managing a living resource bank. It's weirdly empowering. Later, back at camp, you lean some of your older coppice poles into a rough tripod to start building a fence. Not because you have livestock, but because you want livestock. Eventually. Maybe a goat. Or chickens, if you're feeling ambitious. But even without animals, fences matter. They mark territory, provide windbreaks, and offer protection from nighttime wanderers. You work by hand, binding poles with twisted bark and lengths of crude rope made from nettle fibres. It's ugly, a little crooked, but functional, medieval chic. You remember reading once that medieval villagers didn't just have random animals roaming around. They practiced wood pasture, letting livestock graze in managed forests filled with pollarded trees. Shade, food and firewood all in one system. Efficient, sustainable, and completely overlooked by modern survival guides that assume you're going to shoot a deer every time you're hungry. But what if you can't? What if it's winter? What if you're out of arrows and the traps come up empty? That's why the medieval mindset is different. It's not about the kill, it's about the plan. You're not the apex predator here. You're just another creature scratching out a rhythm with the seasons. You take a break around midday, sitting against your now slightly improved fence and gnawing on a strip of roasted root you pretended was jerky. A bird sings high overhead. The rush of wind through the trees brings the sharp, clean scent of damp bark and cold air. Your hands are sticky with sap, your legs ache, and your fingernails are lined with soil. You've never looked more like a peasant, or felt more like one. Here's a side fact to keep your brain busy while your teeth try to break down this fibrous excuse for food. In some places, medieval people created entire commons of managed woodlands, where everyone had rights to gather wood, graze animals, or harvest crops like nuts and berries. It wasn't a free-for-all, it was regulated, often fiercely. But it worked. A whole society based on the idea that you take only what you need in the right season and leave enough behind for the next person or the next generation. Of course, that ideal didn't always hold up. People stole wood, grazed too many animals, or cut at the wrong time. Some historians argue the decline of these systems marked the beginning of real environmental degradation in Europe. Others say they were already cracking by the time industrial pressures showed up. But out here today, so with a bundle of coppice poles and a half-built fence, it still feels like something worth remembering. You walk the perimeter of your camp in the late afternoon, eyeing where you might expand the fence line. You imagine a second hut, a storage lean-to, maybe a pen. And though the idea of livestock still feels like a fantasy, you can't help but smile thinking of a grumpy goat named Edgar eating your thatch roof one day. The sun begins to dip behind the trees. You collect a few more poles and tie them into bundles, then stack them neatly by the fire pit. The light glows golden through the trees, catching the rough angles of your fence and making them look, if you squint, almost intentional. Tonight you'll light another rushlight. Eat another bowl of whatever is still edible. Watch the stars through the smoke hole in your roof and wonder what tomorrow will demand. Because that's what this life is, not a heroic sprint, a slow, relentless rhythm of building, cutting, tending and waiting. But if you're patient, really patient, it might just give back more than it takes. The hide stinks. There's no getting around it. It's draped over a rough-hewn log behind your hut, still damp from the stream where you spent nearly 2 hours scrubbing it with a rock, and no matter how many rinses or soaks you give it, the smell lingers, wet animal and decay, thick enough to taste, but you're not tossing it. That hide is precious. It's going to be your clothes, your boots, your pack straps, if, that is, you can get it tanned before it rots. And that means today is tannery day. Now, here's where medieval survival gets gritty. Tanning is not some pleasant craft with neatly labelled bottles and gloves. It's messy, time-consuming, and smells like you've offended every god at once. But it was essential. You couldn't just skin an animal and wear it. Untreated hides get stiff, crack, or worse, go soft and slimy in the rain. So medieval people developed complex, brilliant, and disgusting ways to preserve them. Today you're doing it the old-fashioned way, using two ingredients nobody talks about anymore: oak galls and alum. You grab your small sack of oak galls, those weird little nodules you collected from the trees a few days ago. They look like malformed acorns or wooden marbles, but they're actually the product of parasitic wasps laying eggs inside oak leaves. The tree responds by forming a gall, and these odd growths happen to be packed with tannins, compounds that bind with the collagen in hides and make them durable, flexible, and, well, wearable. You crush a handful of galls between stones until they turn to powder, then mix it into a pot of hot water, adding a pinch of alum you bartered for weeks ago, or in your case, scrounged up from some ancient sediment in a stream bed and refined into gritty white crystals. Together, the gall and alum make a crude tanning bath, which you pour carefully into a pit you dug behind the hut. It's not glamorous. There's a definite medieval vibe happening. Muddy hole, animal skin, the air full of sharp, earthy smells. But it's how things get done. You submerge the hide using a heavy flat rock to weigh it down. It bubbles slightly, releasing a puff of air that makes you step back, nose wrinkled. The tanning process has begun. Now you wait. Days, sometimes weeks, depending on the method. But you're not just soaking it and hoping. You'll need to massage the hide daily, scrape off more fat and flesh, stretch it over a frame, and work the fibres loose with your hands. Tanning is part chemistry, part physical labour, and part pure grim stubbornness. Most modern preppers never think about leather. Not really. They plan for clothes they already own, not for what happens when those clothes wear out. But in the medieval world, leather was everything. Shoes, belts, bags, pouches, saddle straps, tent ties. It held your life together, literally. And every piece had to be processed by hand. If you didn't tan it, you couldn't use it. And if you didn't know how to tan it, you were dependent on someone who did. You check the hide again before covering the pit. The mixture's already clouding and the hide's taking on a different feel. Less slimy, more tacky. A good sign. You pile turf over the hole and mark it with a branch. It'll be days before it's ready to check again, but you'll keep scraping and working the surface in the meantime. This is your leather now. You can't just toss it and go to the next store. You get one hide, maybe two if you're lucky, and it has to last. You wash your hands in the stream afterwards, scrubbing until your knuckles ache, but the stink won't completely leave. A ghost of animal lingers on your skin, under your nails. It's not pleasant, but there's a weird pride in it. Your hands smell like work, like survival, like memory. You think back to a weird little fact you once read. Tanners were often shunned in medieval towns, not just because of the smell, but because their work was considered unclean. They lived near rivers, usually downstream, and sometimes their neighbourhoods were the only ones outside the town walls. And yet everyone needed them, needed you now, because no one else was going to make their boots waterproof or their saddlebags hold together. And not every tanning method was so refined. Some people used animal brains, yes, actual brains, to soften and tan hides. Others used urine, and in some cultures, dog dung. The ammonia content was part of the magic. There are heated academic arguments over how widespread these more extreme methods were in medieval Europe, but what's clear is that necessity drove innovation, even if it was the kind of innovation you didn't want to talk about over dinner. Back at your hut, you stretch your arms and look at your hands, dry, cracked, with streaks of brown still clinging under your nails. You think about all the things you could make from that one hide, a water skin, maybe a sheath for your knife, or those crude moccasin-like shoes you've been mentally designing. You might even try a sling if the leather's thin and flexible enough. The options grow with each moment you invest in the process. You light a fire and sit beside it, warming your stiff fingers and watching the last bit of sun disappear behind the trees. The wind smells like wet earth and ash. Somewhere far off, a crow calls once, then nothing. Just quiet. You lean back, exhausted but content. You didn't just preserve a hide today. You reconnected with a method so old, so raw, that most people can't even comprehend doing it themselves. You made something real, something ancient, and something deeply yours. The first frost comes like a thief in the night. No warning, no dramatic wind, just a brittle silence and a thin white crust on everything you left outside. Your breath is fog as you crawl out of your shelter, and your fingers are instantly numb. The fire died down too far overnight, and you forgot to bank the coals under enough ash. That mistake greets you now in the form of cold hands, chattering teeth, and a fire pit that's just stone and regret. You crouch, huffing your warm breath into cupped palms, and get to work striking the flint. It takes longer than usual. Your hands don't want to move, and your patience is thinner than it should be. The tinder bundle is damp, your kindling reluctant. But finally, mercifulness, a tiny flame curls to life, catching on the shredded birch bark you tucked into a dry pouch 2 days ago. The smoke rises, your shoulders relax, and you feed it slowly until a small, respectable fire crackles again, bringing your stiff fingers back from the dead. This morning's priority is insulation. You got cocky with your little moss-covered hut. It worked fine in the rain, in the mild cold, but now frost has made it personal. Your walls need reinforcement, and fast. That means hauling more clay, more moss, and a pile of reeds if you can find them. You're already dreading it, but the cold makes everything feel urgent. You head for the marshy edge of the forest, where tall reeds grow in thick, whispering clumps. They're damp from the frost, but not frozen solid, and you hack away at them with a stone knife in your bare hands until you have an awkward bundle under one arm. Back at camp, you wedge the reeds into the gaps of your hut's walls, layering them like shingles, then smear more daub over them for extra seal. You're aiming for insulated burrow vibes. Think medieval hobbit hole Doughtour minus the charm, and with more biting wind. Once the outside is patched, you turn your attention inside. The floor is a disaster. Lumpy mud, half frozen, and about as cozy as a stone slab. You dig it out slightly and fill the depression with dried grass, crumbled bracken. And here comes the star, marsh hay. That's the real secret weapon. Medieval peasants knew that swamp plants were often the warmest bedding around. Cut in late summer and dried carefully, it acted as insulation and a sleeping mat, especially in areas too cold for straw or too poor for wool. You rake together what you can find and start layering it into your sleeping area. It smells vaguely like pond water and decay, but when you lay down on it for a test, the difference is immediate. It's soft, springy, and holds your body heat better than you expected. The reeds in the walls rustle faintly, and for a second you feel almost safe. This is the medieval version of central heating: reeds, fire, and hope. As you lie there staring up at the rafters, sticks jammed together and stuffed with moss, you remember reading about the bedding habits of 14th century peasants. Beds weren't beds like we think of them. Most people slept on wooden platforms piled with hay, leaves, and whatever fabric they could salvage. Feather mattresses were unheard of unless you were royalty. Even blankets might just be old cloaks or strips of wool. You're already halfway there and you didn't even realise it. Here's a strange but true tidbit. In some parts of Europe, people used to sleep with their animals in the same room for warmth. Goats, pigs, chickens, even the occasional cow all huddled up in the human part of the home. The body heat helped during brutal winters, and nobody seemed to mind the smell. You're not there yet, but you're starting to understand why someone might cuddle a goat when it's below freezing. By midday, your hut looks like a badger's dream home. Thick, low walls padded with mud lined with reeds and grasses, the floor soft enough to kneel on without cursing. You light a rushlight and let it burn slowly in the dark corner. The smell of tallow and marsh plants mixing into something almost tolerable. Smoke curls up through your improvised vent hole, and for once it doesn't pool inside like a choking fog. It escapes like it's supposed to. That feels like progress. Still, you're not naive. The real cold hasn't arrived yet. This is just the preview. Winter is waiting in the wings, sharpening its claws, so you make a list in your head. More firewood, a deeper pit for storing food, maybe even dig down and create a cold trap in the floor for storing perishables. You're already eyeing the back corner of the hut, wondering if you could lower it by a few inches without destabilizing everything. It's ambitious. But winter doesn't care how tired you are. Before sundown, you take a walk to check your traps, not expecting much, but routine matters. One snare has been triggered, but the bait is gone and the loop is empty. Another is undisturbed. It's a reminder that calories are precious, and food doesn't just fall into your lap. You pass an old tree on the way back, twisted and gnarled, its bark peeling in thick curls, and think about peeling some for kindling. Then you stop. You need to pace yourself. Even the trees need time to recover. That's the hard truth modern preppers rarely talk about. In a real long-term survival situation, you can't just use. You have to plan, pace, preserve. The forest can feed you, warm you, and shelter you, but only if you give it space to breathe. That night, as you stretch out on your marsh hay and listen to the fire crackle low, the hut feels different. Quieter, warmer, more like something a person lives in, not hides inside. You run your fingers over the reed wall beside you, tracing the rough texture, and for the first time since starting this strange, muddy experiment, you feel a flicker of something dangerous. Comfort. Not much. Just enough to make you worry. Because comfort is the first step toward forgetting how fragile this all is. You're halfway through chewing a mouthful of bark bread when it hits you. This is your life now. Not a weekend experiment, not some wilderness boot camp with a set end date, but a long, uncomfortable drift into the kind of survival that doesn't have applause at the end. Your teeth grind slowly through the flat, greyish disc of bread in your hand. It's dense, dry, and tastes like if cardboard had a nervous breakdown and decided to reinvent itself as food. But its calories, and more importantly, it's a medieval staple when the harvest failed or rats got bold. Welcome to the noble art of eating desperation, bark bread and acorn flour. You finish the bite with a swig of lukewarm water and stare at the loaf cooling by the fire. It's not made from wheat, rye, or even barley. There's no yeast, no butter, just a flour substitute made from inner tree bark and acorns. Yes, really. Because when grain ran out, which it often did in famines, people turned to trees. Birch, elm and pine were the go-to choices. You'd peel away the outer bark to get to the cambium layer, the moist, stringy bit just under the surface, dry it, grind it, and mix it with whatever else you had. In your case, ground acorns, which you spent hours leaching in running water to get rid of the bitterness and tannins, and you still messed it up a little. The loaf is bitter at the edges and slightly gritty, like someone sprinkled sand into a pancake and dared you to eat it, but it's edible. You're not dead, and that's something. You sit back and stretch your legs toward the fire, pulling your patched cloak tighter around your shoulders. Outside, the wind rattles the branches in that half-whispering way that always makes you think something's out there. Something watching, but it's just the forest. And maybe a fox, or a spirit. Honestly, at this point, any of those options feel equally likely. The funny thing is, bark bread, bar bread, wasn't always seen as a failure food. In parts of Scandinavia, it became an actual dish, with methods refined over generations. The Sami people, for example, used pine bark to stretch their flour in harsh winters. It was labour-intensive but respected. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, bark and acorn meals were signs of famine, eaten in silence, with lowered eyes. No one bragged about surviving on bark bread. They just hoped to forget it. You tear off another piece and chew slowly, thinking about how much time and effort went into this one loaf. First, collecting the bark carefully so you didn't kill the tree, then drying it by the fire for days, grinding it with rocks until it was fine enough not to choke on. Then the acorns gathered, cracked, soaked, boiled, soaked again. It took hours, days really, and you burned half of it on your first attempt. Modern survival books rarely mention this level of grind. Everyone wants the 5 foods you can forage today list or some life-hacking miracle plant that solves starvation in one bite. But in the real medieval wilderness, there were no shortcuts. Just work. Bark bread isn't a secret. It's a warning. There's scholarly debate about how common bark bread really was. Some researchers think it was widespread during famines, so much so that it became synonymous with starvation. Others argue it was more regionally specific, tied to forested cultures with the knowledge and tools to make it palatable. But they all agree on one thing: it was always a sign that the grain stores were empty, and winter wasn't done with you yet. You scrape the last bits of batter from your stone and set them aside for drying. Nothing goes to waste now. You're already picturing how to stretch your food supplies through the next cold snap. More acorns if the squirrels haven't beaten you to them. Maybe cattails if the marshes aren't frozen solid. You saw a patch last week but didn't feel like wading through knee-deep muck for roots that taste like soggy celery. You'll feel like it soon. The fire pops, sending a tiny ember floating up toward the roof. You watch it arc and vanish before reaching the moss. Lucky. You still haven't figured out how to fireproof your ceiling aside from praying it stays wet and heavy enough to smother sparks. Something to worry about another day. As the light fades, you wrap what's left of the loaf in a strip of linen and tuck it into your bag. You might not love the taste, but that bitter little disc could be the difference between waking up hungry and waking up desperate. And desperation makes people do dumb things, like wandering too far from camp, or eating berries you think you recognise, or trusting strangers. You remember reading that during one of Europe's worst medieval famines, people were caught grinding down clay and chalk into flour substitutes, anything to fill the stomach, even if it meant slowly starving anyway. Bark and acorns, by comparison, are practically a gourmet option. You toss a few sticks into the fire, watching them catch and curl. Your breath fogs in the cold and the sky outside has gone from grey to charcoal, stars just beginning to glint through the branches. You pull your cloak tighter and lie back on the reed mat. Stomach half full, mind wandering. Maybe tomorrow you'll try roasting the acorns instead of boiling them. Maybe you'll add a few dried nettle leaves to the bark mix, see if that softens the taste. Maybe you'll figure out how to make something that doesn't feel like chewing through punishment. But not tonight. Tonight you survived. With bark. With bitterness, and with just enough quiet resolve to do it again tomorrow. You wake to the sound of dripping water, not rain exactly, but the slow, persistent rhythm of melting frost sliding off tree branches and splattering against your roof. It's the kind of sound that makes you grateful and suspicious at the same time. Warmth, sure, but warmth with consequences, because as the frost retreats, the mud returns. Everything you step on now sucks at your boots like it wants to keep you. And you've already had one close call this week with a boot that came off mid-slog and nearly cost you a sock, a toe, and your remaining dignity. Today's job isn't glamorous. You're not hunting, not building, not boiling hide again for like every known saint. Today you're saving seeds, which sounds peaceful, even relaxing until you realise how much of your future depends on these pathetic little pips and husks currently drying on a slate slab near the fire. Last week you foraged a rough haul. Wild parsnip, garlic mustard, burdock, a few favour pods, and one absolutely miraculous find, a single shrivelled apple, half frozen and clinging to a gnarled old tree like it refused to admit winter had won. You ate half of it that night and picked out the seeds from the rest with trembling fingers, laid them on a cloth, and whispered vague promises to a future garden. That's the thing about medieval survival. It's a lot of planting for a future you might not be around to see. You don't just live day to day. You live for next season, next spring, next year's harvest. Even if famine, rats, floods, or your own questionable foraging decisions take you out, you prepare anyway, because that's what the smart ones did. They didn't just survive, they invested. You kneel beside the slate slab and begin sorting through the seeds, moving them into tiny piles. The fava beans you'll replant directly when the ground softens. Hardy and forgiving, they were a medieval staple for a reason. High in protein, easy to dry, and capable of growing in poor soil. The apple seeds, they are trickier. You'll need to bury them in cold, wet soil, a process called stratification, to trick them into thinking that they've gone through winter. Then, if you're lucky, they'll sprout. In a year, maybe. And don't even think about tasting the apple leaves. Those things are full of cyanide, which is just one more example of nature's ongoing campaign to remind you that food and poison often grow on the same branch. You start preparing your seed stash for long-term storage. First, you dry them completely. No moisture, no mould. Then you wrap them in scraps of linen and tuck them into a lidded pot buried in the coolest part of your shelter. It's not perfect, but it's protected from rodents, damp and temperature swings. These seeds are your hedge against a bad foraging season, or a failed trapline, or another week of bark bread. There's something humbling about sitting cross-legged on a dirt floor, carefully handling dried plant bits like they're gold coins, which in a way they are. Medieval people treated seeds with reverence, because seeds were survival. They had no genetic banks, no online heirloom catalogues. You passed your seed stock down like family heirlooms. Grandparents taught grandkids how to select the best plants for saving, not just the biggest or prettiest, but the hardiest, the survivors, the plants that didn't bolt early or rot in the rain. You weren't just planting food, you were curating resilience. As the day drifts on, you check your little test garden outside the hut. A pathetic patch of scraped soil where you've tucked in a few bulbs and cold-hardened roots. Nothing's sprouted yet. It's too early, too cold, but you crouch beside it anyway, brushing away frost with them in the back of your hand, whispering vague encouragement like it might help. Maybe it does. You wouldn't be the first to talk to plants out here. Solitude gets weird fast. And here's a fun little fringe fact. In medieval Europe, some people believed plants grew better when tended with love, and worse if grown by people in bad moods. There were even rituals around sowing and harvesting, some passed down as folk magic, others absorbed into early Christian traditions. Planting on certain days of the moon cycle, or with a specific prayer, or after sprinkling ashes from the hearth. Survival met spirituality in the dirt, and honestly, you're starting to get why. There's a debate among scholars about how advanced peasant gardening techniques really were. Some argue that most rural people barely manage subsistence-level gardening, no crop rotation, no soil improvement, just dig, plant, pray. Others claim the opposite. That even poor families used compost, companion planting, and careful selection to maximise their tiny plots. Your money's on the latter. People who don't optimise don't last long out here. Before sunset, you finish wrapping your seeds and place the pot in its shallow pit. You mark it with a cross of sticks and weigh the lid down with a rock. It doesn't look like much. In fact, it looks like nothing at all. But it might be the most important thing in your entire camp. Tomorrow, you'll check the wild garlic patch again. Maybe set another snare near the gully where the tracks are fresher. But tonight, as the cold creeps in and the fire finds its rhythm again, you lie down knowing you've taken a step toward next spring. A gesture of defiance, a whispered promise to yourself. You're not just surviving this season, you're planting the bones of the next one. You've been walking for hours with your arms out like an idiot, palms up, holding a forked stick in front of you like you're trying to tune into some ancient forest radio. And you're only mildly embarrassed about it now, because deep down, despite how weird it looks, despite how superstitious it sounds, you're starting to believe that this old stick might actually lead you to water. Welcome to dowsing. the medieval survival method that sits right on the line between science and sorcery. Your dowsing rod is cut from hazel, fresh, green and flexible. You carved it carefully a few days ago after hearing rumours that hazel was the purest wood for the job. Something about it being tied to divination and sacred groves depending on which century's folklore you're looking at. The V-shape fits your hands perfectly, and you've been holding it lightly, letting it float just above your wrists, waiting for the subtle twitch that some people swear will point you toward underground water. You don't have access to sonar, mapping apps or satellite data. What you do have is a growing thirst, a dry patch of camp soil, and a memory of reading that dowsing was common enough in the Middle Ages to be both respected and ridiculed. Some people treated it like a legitimate trade, others lumped it in with alchemy and astrology, and looked away politely when it didn't work. Still, plenty of old farmers swore by it, and today you're one of them. Your feet crunch over frost-stiff leaves as you move slowly through the trees, eyes on the rod. You're not looking for drama, no lightning bolt, no sudden pull, just a dip, a slight lean. You've been at it long enough that your arms are sore, and your hope is more muscle memory than belief, but you keep walking. Because the truth is, whether or not this stick works, you need to find water. The stream near your camp is fine for now, but it's surface water, easily contaminated, prone to drying up in the wrong season. What you want is something deeper, a spring, a seep, even a muddy patch you could dig into with a sharpened stick and a prayer. Then it happens, not dramatic, not even clear at first, but as you pass between two moss-covered boulders, the rod gives a gentle tug downward. You freeze, adjust your grip, take another step. It dips again, stronger this time. You take 3 more steps, nothing, then backtrack. There it is, a little zone no bigger than a doorway, where the stick consistently moves. You mark it with a fallen branch and drop to your knees, hands to the earth. You dig with your knife at first, scraping away the topsoil, then with both hands. The ground is cold but not frozen, damp but not wet. You keep going, clawing through layers of leaf litter, clay and root hair until the soil darkens and holds its shape when you squeeze it. That's when you know you're close. And then, glory water. Just a shimmer at first, a hint of moisture in the bottom of your pit. But you dig deeper, and it pools. Slow, silty, reluctant. But it's there. You widen the hole, scoop out the mow, and soon you've got a rough, shallow basin that reflects the pale winter sky. You could kiss it if it weren't so full of grit. You fill your water skin with care, straining through a cloth to catch the worst of the dirt. You'll still boil it later, obviously, but there's something reassuring about knowing you found it. Not by map, not by guesswork, but by feel. Here's a quirky historical side note for your now muddied brain. Dowsing rods weren't just used for water. Some folks used them to find lost objects, buried treasure, even criminals. In the 17th century, people claimed dowsers could sniff out ore veins for mining companies. It got serious enough that in some places they were banned as witches. Other times they were hired as experts. That's medieval logic for you. Suspect the tool, but also offer it a job. Modern science, of course, rolls its eyes at dowsing. Studies suggest it's all about unconscious muscle movements, ideomotor responses, if you want the term. You move the rod without realizing it, responding to changes in terrain, slope, or just wishful thinking. And maybe that's all it is, but you're not here to win debates. You're here to drink clean water. You carve a few drainage channels around the little pit to keep runoff out, then line it with stones to hold the sides. It's crude, ugly, but functional. You mark the spot with a woven reed flag, something simple so you can find it again in a storm or snow. Back at camp, you'll dig out an old clay pot to stash here for dipping water, maybe even build a lid if you find enough bark. You're not just collecting water now, you're managing it. This is the part of medieval survival people overlook. It's not just about staying alive, it's about getting ahead. Every new system you build gives you space to think, to plan. You're not running from disaster anymore, you're preparing for the next one. The sun is dipping low again, and your hands are raw from digging. But your belly's warm with the thought that you just gave yourself a backup plan. A second source, a little security in a world that doesn't hand it out for free. You stand, stretch, and look out over the trees. Somewhere under these roots and rocks, water flows, quiet, hidden, steady. And now you know how to find it. Maybe the stick really did lead you here. Maybe it was just dumb luck. Either way, you'll be drinking tonight. Smoke stings your eyes before breakfast, curling through the cracks in your hut, thick and lazy like it's in no hurry to leave. You squint against it, blinking away tears as you fan your hand toward the roof vent, then poke at the low fire that's been struggling since dawn. There's a slab of meat nearby, hung up and beginning to sweat in the rising warmth. A rabbit, barely enough for 2 meals, and more bone than bulk, but it's hanging in a little shelter of woven sticks and mud you've built next to the main fire. Not to cook, to cure, because today you're making a medieval smokehouse, or at least the peasant version, rough, small, and probably carcinogenic. You remember how hard it was to catch this thing, how many nights the snare came up empty, how the wire had to be adjusted over and over until you found just the right game trail. When you finally got the rabbit, you cleaned it fast, skinned it in the cold, and left the hide to soak with the others in the tanning pit. Then you turned to preservation, because in this world, meat that isn't preserved is meat you're going to watch rot in real time, and you're not doing that again. So you built the frame, nothing fancy, just some bent hazel rods for the skeleton and thick mud daubed between to seal the gaps. There's a small fire pit dug right into the floor, offset from the centre to avoid torching your meat. A low vented roof with a smoke hole and not much else. Think of it like a slow cooker built by a bored badger with anger issues. And now it's filled with smoke, not flames, not heat, just smoke. That's the goal. Smoke curing is slow, days slow. The idea is to dry the meat gently while infusing it with compounds that kill bacteria, fungi, and anything else that would normally be happy to feast on your food before you do. You've salted the meat first, just like the old guides say, rubbing in as much rock salt as you could spare, then letting it sit overnight to pull out moisture. That salt is gold now, literal survival currency. And now the meat is dangling from a greenwood hook, drying in the smoke. You check the fire, add more damp bark and moss to keep the smoke thick and cool, then seal the door. You'll come back later to turn the meat and make sure it hasn't dropped into the ash again. That happened once. You don't want to talk about it. Back near your main camp, the smell's already creeping into your clothes, earthy, rich and slightly acrid. But it's not a bad smell. It smells like you're doing something right. Like you're not just reacting to hunger anymore, you're preparing. And here's the strange beauty of it. Smokehouses weren't just tools in medieval Europe, they were social centres. The shared smokehouse in a village could feed multiple families, with meats hanging from labelled hooks and rotating hands keeping the fire alive. People traded space in the smokehouse for labour or salt or favours. If you had access to one, you were doing all right. If you owned one, you had leverage. It was the medieval version of cold storage, and just as political. You remember reading that certain wood types were preferred. Fruit woods, mostly, apple, cherry, sometimes alder, mild enough to not overpower the meat, but still rich in resins and oils that preserved flavour. You have none of that. You're burning whatever you've got. Damp pine, rotten birch, moss clumps soaked in their own swampy juices. It'll be smokier, probably harsher, maybe a little toxic if you don't watch the temperature, but it'll work. Later in the day, you check on the rabbit. The skin has dried to a tight leathery gloss. The fat is stiff at the edges. You prod it gently, it's firming up. You rotate the stick it hangs from, shielding your eyes as more smoke rolls past your face, and smile. It's happening. You're making preserved meat. Not jerky, not salted slabs in barrels. This is something in between. Smoky, so tough, slightly sweet from the sap. It might not be pretty, but it'll last. You spend the afternoon gathering more wood, careful not to use anything green enough to drip resin directly into your food, and reshaping the smoke vent to control the flow. It's trial and error. Smoke curls the wrong way, lingers too long, pools in your hut, chokes your lungs. But you adjust, patch with mud, block the wind with old bark slabs. Eventually the draft evens out. The smoke rises smooth and steady, curling around the meat like a promise. By evening the meat is darker, the colour of old oak. You run your fingers over the surface and it's dry to the touch, no longer tacky. You could eat it now, but you won't, not yet. You're going to push it further, let the smoke finish its work. Patience is survival's secret sauce. While you wait, you cook a stew with some old dried nettles and the last chunk of root mash. Flavourless mostly, but the smell of the smoking rabbit makes the meal feel more indulgent than it is. You're already thinking about how to stretch it. Maybe a little broth. Maybe slice it into thin strips to eat over days. Maybe hide half in the thatch where the rats can't get it. Probably wishful thinking. Here's a bizarre fringe fact to chew on with your grey stew. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed smoked meat carried protective energy, not just from spoilage, but from evil spirits. It was hung above doors, placed in travellers' packs, even buried in fields to ward off crop failure. Meat wasn't just food, it was magic. You're not quite ready to stuff rabbit jerky under your pillow, but honestly, if it helps you sleep through another frozen night, you'd try it. There's scholarly argument too about how accessible smoke curing was. Some say it was mainly for the wealthy, people with enough meat to bother preserving. Others argue that peasants used it all the time, not just for meat, but for cheese, fish, and even vegetables. You've started to believe the latter, because if you've gone to all the trouble of catching food in a world where nothing comes easy, you're going to want to keep it as long as humanly possible. Night falls, and the forest goes quiet. You bank the fire in the smokehouse, seal the vent slightly, and sit back in the glow of your own fading flame. Your hands smell like ash and salt, your clothes like a campfire's ghost. But you feel something else too, something sharper than comfort, satisfaction. You turn scarcity into security, a tiny sliver of luxury in a world that doesn't hand those out often. Tomorrow, you'll taste the meat, not all of it, just enough to know it worked, enough to remember that, here in the cold woods with your mud hut and strange habits, you are still learning, still adapting, still alive. The bees were never supposed to be part of the plan. You'd hope to keep your distance, maybe steal some wild honey from a hollow log, thank them for their service, and run. But now you're standing waist deep in the woods, face wrapped in a loosely woven linen hood that smells like old broth, clutching a bundle of burning birch bark and wondering if this is how you die. Not from starvation, not from cold, but from bee-related overconfidence. Welcome to medieval beekeeping, or more accurately, bee borrowing with a high chance of regrets. It all started with that hollow tree you passed last week, the one with the dark stain running down the bark and the low, constant hum if you stood very still. You marked it then, thinking, maybe, someday, if you got desperate enough you'd come back and try your luck. That day is now. Sugar cravings have a way of rearranging priorities. You wave the smoke gently into the hole, hoping the old trick still works. Smoke calms the bees, masks the alarm pheromones they release when they decide to turn you into a pincushion. Medieval beekeepers knew this. They used smudge pots, bundles of herbs, even rotten wood soaked in water to create thick, sleepy smoke. You're improvising with birch bark and dry moss, which smells oddly pleasant and acrid at the same time. You wait. Long enough to sweat under the hood. Long enough for your heart to do that nervous dance in your ribs. Then slowly you reach your arm toward the hollow. You don't want to destroy the colony, you just want to taste. A bit of comb. You slip your knife inside, feeling for the edge of wax, and slice. Carefully, slowly, as though bees understand courtesy. When you pull your hand back, it's clutching a dripping chunk of honeycomb. Golden and sticky, already melting under your fingers. A few bees follow, drunk on smoke and confusion, but none sting. Not yet. You back away, slow as you can, until you're out of range. Then run. Back at camp, you sit in the sun, breathless and grinning, licking honey from your fingers like a child caught in the pantry. It's sweeter than you remember, sharp, floral, alive. There's wax in your teeth and you don't care. This is feast-level luxury. In a life of roots, bark and dried nettles, honey is liquid gold. Medicine, food, preservation aid, even candle fuel, bees were their multi-tool of medieval survival. And unlike you, medieval peasants didn't just raid wild hives. They kept bees. Not in tidy wooden boxes with brass fittings, but in skeps, dome-shaped hives made from coiled straw or hollow logs. These weren't built to inspect, they were built to harvest. And unfortunately, that meant the bees often didn't survive the season. You harvested the honey by destroying the hive or driving the bees out with sulfur smoke. It was brutal but efficient. You don't have a proper skep yet, but your mind's already turning. There's that hollow stump near the stream. What if you plugged the back and carved a small entry hole? Baited it with wax and honey residue. Let nature do the work. You might just end up with a colony by spring, or a bear. But hey, you're already living dangerously. There's something deeply human about this. About risking your skin for sweetness. About interacting with a creature that's been around since before fire. Before tools. and somehow convincing it to share. Beekeeping is one of those ancient arts, part science, part magic. Egyptian tombs have honey jars still sealed. Vikings carried chunks of comb in their supply packs. Medieval monks kept meticulous records of hive health and wax yields. Even the peasants knew how to watch the flowers and guess the hive's mood. Of course, not everyone agreed on how it worked. There's an ongoing scholarly tug-of-war about medieval bee lore. Some sources insist people believed bees were born from ox carcasses or tears of the sun. Others show a more grounded understanding. Hive cycles, queen bees, swarming patterns. The truth likely depended on where you lived and how many stings you'd taken to the face that year. You spend the afternoon melting the remaining comb gently near the fire, separating the wax from the honey. Their wax goes into a small clay pot, future candle fuel, maybe even waterproofing material. You could seal the seams of your water skin, reinforce the base of your boots, or try your hand at a rushlight upgrade. The honey, that goes into your stomach, some now, some saved in a scrap of hide knotted at the corners like a sad little pouch of joy. Well, here's something weird and wonderful to add to the medieval trivia pile. People believed bees could sense dishonesty. If the beekeeper died, someone had to tell the bees or they'd abandon the hive. A real thing. There are documented traditions in which families whispered news to the hives like they were part of the household. Marriages, births, deaths. If you didn't, the bees might leave, or die, or turn sour. Superstition, maybe, but after today you're kind of on their side. As dusk falls, you sit by the fire and break off a tiny piece of your hard-earned honeycomb to smear onto a dry flatbread. It melts into the cracks like butterwood in a better life. You chew slowly, savouring every moment, every stingless second. You're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding a memory, a tradition, something older than you, older than the forest, older than fire, a trade between species that feels more like a truce than a theft. You glance toward the dark woods, where the hive still hums quietly in the distance. You'll leave them something next time, a little respect, maybe a flower, or just your silence. You can't remember the last time your hands didn't smell like smoke, dirt, or something vaguely unpleasant and unidentifiable. Today, the scent is unmistakable. Lye. Sharp, acrid, and slightly sweet in that way only alkaline death can be. Your fingertips are raw, your knuckles cracked, and your sleeves are stiff with ash water. Congratulations. You've decided it's time to make medieval soap, or at least something pretending to be soap, which is really just a caustic sludge that either cleans you or dissolves your skin. We'll find out soon enough. It started with the grease. You'd saved it, collected in a little clay pot from that rabbit a few days ago, the scraps of fat from your last lucky catch. Rendering it was disgusting, and your hut smelled like the inside of a chimney for days. But it was necessary. Fat is one of the holy trinity ingredients of medieval soap making. Fat, lye, and water. Easy to find, hard to handle. You've got the fat, you've got the water, and now you're making lye. How? With ashes, of course. Not just any ash. Hardwood ash, preferably from oak, beech, or ash trees. Softwoods like pine don't cut it. You gather a pile from your fire pit, then pour it into a rough basket you wove from reeds and coated with clay to make it semi-waterproof. You suspend the basket over a bowl and begin the slow ritual of pouring water over the ashes, letting it drip through, leaching out the potassium hydroxide that makes lye. The first few runs are weak, barely stinging your fingertips. But after repeating the process for most of the morning, you test it the medieval way. Drop in a feather, if it dissolves, strong enough. And that's when things get dangerous. You mix the hot rendered fat with your freshly brewed ash water in a small pot over a low flame, stirring constantly with a carved stick you now consider a sacrificial tool. The mixture doesn't look like soap. It looks like something you'd find in a swamp and avoid. But as it heats, it begins to thicken, to bubble, to turn into the greasy, gelatinous sludge of progress. It's sticky, it's gritty, and it's working. Soap, in the medieval sense, wasn't about luxury. It wasn't perfumed or pastel or shaped like a duck. It was rough, brown, and smelled faintly of boiled fat and old decisions. But it got the job done. It cut through grease, washed clothes, cleaned haze, even acted as rudimentary shampoo if you hated your scalp enough. And people used it. Not daily, maybe not even weekly, but when they could, and especially in preparation for holy days or major events. Cleanliness wasn't constant, but it had its place. You pour the mixture into a mould made from a split gourd and set it near the fire to cure. It won't be ready for days, maybe weeks, depending on how long it takes to harden. But you're already thinking ahead to laundry. Your clothes haven't been washed properly since... Actually, they've never been washed properly. You've rinsed them in streams, beaten them on rocks like an angry cave person, and maybe waved them in the direction of fire smoke. But soap changes the game. You haul your tunic, wool trousers, and the linen underlayer you try to pretend still exists down to the stream, along with a hunk of your early soap batch. It's still soft, slippery, and kind of vile smelling. But it foams, barely. You scrub until your fingers go numb, against rocks, with coarse grass, even with your own boot heel. And when you rinse the water away, it is dark with filth. A satisfying kind of shame. You do the same with your gear, knife sheath, your makeshift pack, even the inside of your cloak, where sweat has turned the fabric stiff. Everything gets a lye bath, whether it likes it or not. Here's the catch, though. Lye soap is strong, too strong. You learn that the hard way when your hands start itching and you realise you didn't rinse thoroughly enough. Medieval people knew this too. There's evidence they would cut lye soap with clay or plant oils to make it less aggressive. Some would even scent it if they could afford the herbs or essential oils, which you definitely cannot. Still, you keep a bit of the lye water aside for other uses. It doubles as a disinfectant, useful for cleaning cuts or scrubbing tools. You could even use it in tanning or making glue. It's basically medieval bleach, and yeah, it's made from campfire trash and leftover fat. Here's a fun fringe fact for your raw, soapy hands. In some parts of medieval Europe, soap wasn't just a utility, it was regulated. Cities had public soap boilers and designated areas where the process could take place, mostly because of the smell and risk of fire. Soap makers were often guild members, and their recipes were closely guarded. You, however, are a one-person guild, and your only regulation is don't explode the hut. Back at camp, your clothes hang over a line of twine made from twisted bark fibre, dripping slowly. You sit beside them, the scent of the lye and smoke lingering in the air, and notice something unexpected. The air smells clean. Not floral, not nice, but clean. Less like a midden pit, more like civilization. Scholars still debate how often medieval peasants bathed or washed their clothes. Some argue it was rare, reserved for festivals or major events. Others point out that public bathhouses existed even in small towns, and many people did value cleanliness. Just not by modern standards. You're inclined to believe the latter. Anyone who's ever worn the same wool tunic for 6 weeks knows that the washing isn't about vanity. It's about survival. You glance at your stiff, drying clothes, and at the little lump of soap sitting by the fire, curing like a foul cheese. It's ugly, it's uneven, it might eat through your skin if you're not careful, but it's yours, and that means something. You're staring at a tree like it owes you money, or bread, or literally any kind of real food. Because you've reached that low, lurching part of the survival curve where meals no longer involve recipes, or even ingredients, just whatever doesn't poison you, and maybe won't shatter your molars. Welcome to Bark Bread Part 2. Edible desperation, starring the unglamorous duo of ground acorns and shredded tree. This isn't a special occasion. You're not celebrating. You're out of everything. The root cellar, or pit really, is nearly bare. The last turnip you had was more root than vegetable, and you're honestly starting to wonder if your belt's gotten looser, or if you're just finally noticing your ribs. The cold doesn't help. Every calorie matters now, and every mistake costs something. So you look at trees. You've already scouted which ones are worth trying. Birch, pine, spruce, maybe elm if you can find a healthy one. The goal isn't the bark you see, the flaky outer layer that peels like a sunburn, but the cambium, the tender inner layer between the bark and the wood. That's the good stuff. Or, well, the least awful stuff. You peel back a section of bark with your knife, careful not to girdle the tree. You want it to survive if you ever get desperate enough to come back for more. The inner bark is pale, stringy, and vaguely moist, like vegetable jerky that's given up. You scrape it into a pouch and move on, eyes scanning for more candidates. Back at camp, you begin the slow, soul-crushing process of turning this mess into flour. The inner bark gets dried, either in the sun or near the fire, depending on your level of patience, and then crushed. Crushed again, ground into fibrous powder with the back of a flat rock, while your hands cramp and your stomach makes whale noises. You mix it with leached acorn meal, which is finally not bitter after several days of soaking and boiling and soaking again. Then you add a splash of water and stir it into a paste. You're not proud of what you're doing. The dough smells like wet mulch and tastes like it wants to apologise. But this isn't about taste. It's about staying upright. You flatten it into rough discs and lay them on a hot stone by the fire. They don't rise. Of course they don't. There's no yeast, no starter, no gluten, no hope. What you get is something between a cracker and a roof tile. You pick one up and tap it against a rock. It makes a sound. The first bite is like chewing old rope dipped in dirt. It sticks to your teeth, flakes in your mouth, and somehow manages to taste like every bad idea you've ever had. But the second bite is easier, and by the third your body is too grateful to care. You eat slowly, thinking about how many people in history lived off this exact same meal. During the Great Famine of 1315, entire communities turned to bark bread and acorns to survive. When grain failed, when rain flooded the fields for months, when livestock dropped dead from disease, this was all they had. There are records of people eating moss, grass, even clay. Compared to that, tree bread starts to feel like a feast. Here's a particularly grim historical footnote. Some regions in northern Europe referred to famine as bark year. It became shorthand. This was a bark year, meaning we ate trees again. It wasn't dramatic. It was just routine. The expectation that hunger would return, and with it the forest menu. And here's the weird part. Some of them got good at it. In places like Finland and Norway, bark flour recipes evolved over centuries. People learned to blend it with grain to make it stretch further. They developed specific harvesting techniques, seasonal preferences, even fermentation methods. What started as desperation became innovation. You chew your last piece of bread slowly, letting it sit in your stomach like ballast. Not comfortable, not satisfying, but grounding. You've bought yourself another day, another night. Afterward, you save the crumbles, sweeping them from your bark tray into a pouch made from scrap linen. Waste nothing. Even now, you're eyeing the base of that birch tree outside your shelter, wondering how many more strips you can take before it starts to suffer. You'll give it a few days, maybe offer it a thanks you whisper just in case. You wash the paste bowl with snow, your fingers aching in the chill, and reflect on how strange it is to call this normal. Just a few weeks ago, you were grumbling about dry beans and stale rice. Now you're surviving on tree dust and squirrel leftovers, and it feels like progress. A log pops in the fire and you lean in, stealing as much heat as your face can handle before your eyebrows start to sweat. You tuck the remaining bark flour into a sealed pot, wrap it with cloth and hide it under the sleeping mat like treasure, because it is treasure. There's a silence that falls after hunger is answered, not cured, just pushed back a little. You lie on your mat, stomach heavy with bark and bitterness, and listen to the wind outside press against your shelter. Tomorrow you'll try for cattails again, maybe find more acorns, maybe even fish, but tonight you lived off a tree, and somehow you're still here. You didn't think much about beds before this, back in the world of pillows and mattresses and fitted sheets that only ever fit when the moon was right. Sleep was a passive thing. You climbed into it, it received you. But out here in the brittle-boned world of medieval survival, sleep has to be built. And tonight, you're determined to finally build something that doesn't leave you waking up crooked and damp with a slug on your cheek. You start by scouting. You've already half convinced yourself that there's a magical plant out here somewhere. A medieval mattress waiting to be discovered. Thick and springy and mysteriously bug-repellent. No such luck. Just more of what you've seen before. Bracken, reeds, straw and marsh plants that squelch when you step on them. But then you remember the old trick you read about. Marsh beds. It was common, apparently. Peasants near wetlands didn't just curse the muck, they harvested it. Thick mats of dried sedge and reeds became bedding, insulation, even thatch. It was all about layering. Overlap the plants, let them dry, pile them high, and you had something that approximated a bed. So that's your plan. No more damp moss, no more mud-caked cloaks. Tonight you're going to sleep on a pile of swamp grass and be grateful for it. You start with reeds, long, bendy, and full of spikapem. They grow tall and proud near the edge of the marsh, and you cut them low with your knife, bunching them into tight bundles as you go. The sun's already starting to dip, casting gold across the water, and you work faster, dragging your bundles back to camp one armload at a time. Then comes the layering. You clear the space beside your fire pit, scraping up the worst of the old bedding, damp moss, clumps of crumbling bark, the occasional mystery critter hiding underneath, and lay down the reeds. First in one direction, then the next, crisscrossed, braided, thick enough that your knees don't immediately hit the dirt when you kneel on it. You toss on some bracken for softness, then line the edges with dry grass to keep it from scattering every time you roll over. The result is something between a nest and a coffin. A marsh-born sleeping platform that smells like pond water and sun. You lie down cautiously, expecting the usual jab of a hidden stick or squirm of some damp horror. But no, it's soft, not plush, not warm, but better. The reeds lift you just enough off the cold earth to insulate. Your body heat isn't leaching away like usual, and the bracken, surprisingly kind on the back. Of course, the bugs haven't arrived yet. That's the real test. There's a fringe fact that floats through your mind as you adjust the mat. Medieval folks believed that sleeping too close to the ground could unbalance the humours, not just because it was cold or uncomfortable, but because the earth itself was thought to drain your vitality. Beds weren't just about softness, they were about separation. Even a few inches mattered. Which is why some peasants went to the trouble of raising their straw bedding on simple wooden frames, or in wealthier homes, on ropes strung between bedposts. Hence the phrase, sleep tight. You don't have ropes or a frame, but what you do have is elevation. Even a few inches of plant material between you and the cold mud feels like a small miracle. Is the difference between shivering and sleeping. After testing your new bed for a while, adjusting, shifting, flopping around like a fish, you light the fire and settle in with a flat piece of bark that serves as your dinner plate. Tonight's meal is another miracle of not dying, a thin soup made from boiled cattail roots and the last smears of smoked rabbit grease. It's barely food, but it's hot, and it makes your stomach stop complaining. Outside, the wind rattles the trees. Your shelter groans under the pressure, but holds. Inside, the smoke drifts lazily through the roof vent, the scent mingling with the marsh reeds to create something not pleasant, but familiar, like a very tired forest. Here's something curious. In some old texts, there's mention of bed herbs, plants like mugwort, lavender and wormwood, tucked into bedding to deter fleas, lice and other bitey freeloaders. Some were even believed to promote dreams or keep away evil spirits. You've got none of those, but you toss a few mint leaves into your reed pile just to pretend. It can't hurt. And if you dream less about freezing to death, you'll count it as magic. As you stretch out across your makeshift marsh bed, wrapped in a cloak that now smells of smoke and soap sludge, you realise something strange. You're not miserable. You're not even that uncomfortable. You've spent so many nights contorted around roots and stones that this feels like a luxury suite. A woven cradle of plant matter that for a few hours makes the wilderness feel like a home. The fire pops, the wind howls, and you lie there, just high enough off the earth to imagine that maybe for once you've outsmarted it. Of course, you'll need to rebuild the whole thing next week, but tonight, you sleep. There's a new rattle in your breath this morning, a dry, gritty wheeze that you feel more than hear. You sit up on your marsh bed and immediately regret it. Everything aches. Your ribs feel like they've been stepped on twice. Your head is thick and distant, like it's stuffed with wet straw, and your joints creak as you move. Congratulations, you're sick. And not the take a nap and chug orange juice kind. This is full-blown, medieval, something is wrong sick. And out here, that's more than inconvenient. It's dangerous. You stumble outside for air, but the cold punches you square in the lungs. Coughing racks your body, doubling you over until you see stars. Your fire's out, of course it is, and your throat feels like someone scrubbed it with nettles. You lean against the hut and try to figure out your options, which are predictably terrible. There are no antibiotics, no thermometers, no urgent care clinics with complimentary lollipops. Just dirt, desperation, and a half-remembered list of medieval remedies, most of which involve herbs you don't have, and instructions like, apply leeches until improvement, which, to be clear, will not be happening. You crawl back into the hut and grab your pouch of dried plants. It's pitiful. Some nettle, a few mint leaves, a handful of dried yarrow you plucked weeks ago just because it smelled nice. Now you wish you'd hoarded more. Yarrow was used for everything. Fevers, wounds, bleeding, ghosts, allegedly. You crumble a few leaves into a pot of water and set it over the fire you're struggling to restart. The smoke makes your cough worse, but eventually the flames catch and the pot begins to simmer. You sip it slowly, scalding your tongue on the first swallow. It tastes like weeds and disappointment, but the warmth helps, and after the third cup, your chest loosens a little. Your body's still fighting, but at least now it's got backup. And while you're stuck here, wrapped in a scratchy cloak and fighting to keep your internal organs inside your body, you start thinking about how medieval people actually handled this. Spoiler, badly. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a swirling mess of herbal knowledge, religious belief, superstition, and outright guesswork. Some of it worked, a lot of it didn't. Take bloodletting, for example. For centuries, doctors believed that illness was caused by imbalanced humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and that the solution was to remove the excess, cue the leeches, or, if you didn't have leeches handy, a knife and a bowl. You're not trying that, you're miserable, not suicidal. Still, not all medieval medicine was nonsense. Some herbs had real benefits: willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, honey as an antiseptic. The trouble was knowing how much to use, and when, and what not to mix. And considering you're operating with the medical toolkit of a particularly illiterate hedge witch, you decide to stick to basics. You pull out your little pot of honey, the last of the hive-raided batch, and take a spoonful. It soothes your throat instantly, coating it in something thicker than hope. You chase it with another cup of hot yarrow tea and lie back on your bed of reeds, breathing slow, letting the heat sink into your bones. That's when you notice the bruise on your side. It's not just a bruise, it's swollen and tender. And you suddenly remember slipping on the frost 2 days ago and landing hard against a tree root. You thought it was nothing. Now it feels like your ribs are trying to secede from your body. You prod gently. Nothing seems broken, just bruised. Probably, maybe. That's when you remember bone setters, the medieval medics who specialised in resetting dislocations and treating fractures. They weren't doctors, technically, more like craftsmen of the human body, often self-taught, often terrifying. They'd yank limbs back into place with nothing but a rag to bite and a prayer to St. Apollonia. But despite the trauma, many people walked away healed. Some even lived long enough to say thank you. You're grateful you don't need setting, just rest. Maybe some wild garlic poultices if you can find the plant still green under the frost. Maybe a warm stone against your ribs to soothe the swelling. But mostly, you need to lie here and let your body do what it does best, Trias. You drift in and out of sleep, curled up like a child, sweating through your layers as the fire crackles beside you. You dream of warmth, of stone bathhouses filled with steam and herbal oils. Not real memories, just fragments. Wishful thinking. Somewhere in the haze, you imagine a medieval infirmary. Cots lined up in a cold monastery, a nun pressing cool cloths to someone's forehead. Maybe yours, maybe someone else's. The line between history and fever blurs. You wake up at dusk, weak but alive. The pain's still there, but the fire hasn't gone out, and your tea is still warm. That feels like a victory. Here's a weird little fringe fact to lift your spirits. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed disease was spread by bad smells, miasmas. So they'd carry fragrant herbs in little pouches or masks, hoping to ward off illness with scent. It wasn't entirely wrong either. In a world without sanitation, bad smells often did indicate rot and disease. Their logic was flawed, but their instincts weren't terrible. You breathe in the scent of your hut, smoke, honey, mint, and whatever the reeds are doing, and you can almost believe it's keeping you safe. Almost. Tomorrow you'll go look for more herbs, maybe even try to build a proper bed frame so your ribs aren't pressed against the ground all night. But for now, you pull your cloak tight, sip another mouthful of bitter tea, and close your eyes. The medieval world doesn't stop when you're sick, it just leans in and watches, curious to see if you're strong enough to keep going. You're not sure if you are, but you're still breathing. Your ribs still throb when you move too fast, and your cough hasn't fully surrendered. But today you're out of bed, out of tea, and out of patience. Survival, as it turns out, doesn't care much about your recovery time. There's work to do, and winter's been breathing down your neck with more confidence each morning. So you tighten the sash on your cloak, take a deep breath that ends in a wheeze, and decide that today is about protection. Specifically, protecting what you've built. Welcome to Field Fortifications, Peasant Edition, where your tools are mud, sticks, and a growing distrust of everything that moves in the woods after sunset. You've already had one close call. Last week, something sniffed around your camp in the dark. Could have been a fox, maybe a feral dog, could have been something worse. Whatever it was, it left tracks and a warm pile of not a welcome gift near your drying rack. That's when you started thinking about defences, not traps exactly, but barriers. Simple structures to slow down anything with teeth, claws, or bad intentions. The medieval peasant didn't have stone castles or iron portcullises. What they had was dirt, and ditches, and a truly impressive ability to weaponize mud and anxiety. So you follow their lead. You start by digging, not deep, a shallow trench that rings the front of your shelter, just enough to create uneven footing and a mental "you don't belong here" sign for anything walking on four legs. Next comes the brush barrier, a pile of thorny branches you've been collecting during your foraging trips. You wedge them upright along the ditch, angling the points outward. It's primitive, but even a desperate predator will hesitate before charging into a wall of splinters. The trick is randomness. You scatter sharp stakes at different angles, some hidden under leaves, not to kill, just to confuse. In medieval times, this was known as abatis, and while it was mostly used on battlefields, even rural folk picked up the trick when wolves or raiders got bold. Then there's the alarm system. Medieval folks didn't have motion sensors, but they did have hanging pots, dry branches, and chickens, though you have none of those. So you improvise. You string dried rushes and brittle reeds along a cord between two trees. If anything walks through it, the crackling noise will alert you. It's not foolproof, but it's better than waking up to something breathing on your face. By midday, your camp looks a bit like a failed art installation, but it's defended. Sort of. You're under no illusion that this would stop a determined attacker. But that's not the point. You're buying time. A few seconds to grab your knife. A moment's warning before something crosses the threshold of your little kingdom of moss and mud. As you work, your mind drifts back to the idea of burhs, those early medieval fortified villages in Anglo-Saxon England. They weren't castles, not in the fairy tale sense. They were towns surrounded by earthworks. Ditches, wooden palisades, compacted walls. It was all about discouraging invaders, not with brute strength, but with inconvenience. If it's hard to get in, they'll go somewhere else. That principle still holds. You can't build a wall around the forest, but you can make your tiny patch of dirt just annoying enough to be left alone. After lunch, a depressing combination of thin nettle broth and a few mouthfuls of leftover bark bread, you decide to reinforce the door to your hut. Currently, it's a flap of woven reeds that laughs in the face of both wind and intruders. You replace it with a more solid construct. 2 large hazel branches tied together with cord and packed with mud and straw, then propped against the opening like a shield. It won't stop a bear, but it might make one pause long enough for you to not be in the way when it comes through. You hang your knife by the entrance. Not as a threat, more like a reminder. Survival isn't passive, it's something you have to assert, defend, patch up every day until it becomes a reflex. That's what the medieval mindset was about. They didn't expect the world to be safe. They just made it expensive to attack. Here's a strange but true fringe fact to chew on while you test your new door. Some medieval people would bury iron objects, knives, nails, even rusted horseshoes around their homes to ward off evil spirits. The idea was that iron repelled bad luck, disease, or curses. Superstition? Maybe. But you're not above jabbing an old nail into the ground if it keeps your soup unbothered. There's also a scholarly debate about how widespread these small-scale defences really were. Some historians argue that most peasants were too busy surviving to build barriers. Others point to archaeological digs that show clear evidence of rural compounds with layered fortifications, stakes, ditches, and even early fences. The truth probably varies by region. But one thing's for sure, no one trusted the forest completely. As the light fades, you light your fire and sit just inside your new perimeter. You feel safer, but secure, never that, but buffered. You've put something between yourself and the night, even if it's just a few sticks and some well-placed anxiety. You sip a cup of hot water, stare out past your reed curtain, and listen. The wind is restless, leaves rustle. Something moves out in the dark, but it doesn't come close. Maybe it smelled you. Maybe it saw the outline of your traps and decided to keep walking. Or maybe it's waiting. You toss more wood onto the fire and pull your cloak tight around your shoulders. Your ribs ache with the movement, but the heat seeps into your bones and the ring of brush outside your hut glows faintly in the firelight. Let the woods watch. You've drawn your line. You're squatting behind a tree with your trousers down and a fistful of moss in your hand, and for the first time in your life you genuinely miss toilet paper. Not the store brand stuff either. The good kind. The kind with little clouds printed on the packaging, and at least 3 meaningless marketing buzzwords like ultra-soft, eco-layered, or comfort shield. But those days are long gone. It's just you, the woods, and whatever nature decided to grow in reach. And today that happens to be moss. Cold, damp, and surprisingly plush. This is the side of survival no one wants to romanticize. Not even the medieval reenactors in linen tunics and braided belts like to talk about sanitation. It's always swords and bread ovens, never what you do when nature calls in the middle of a frost. But out here, this stuff matters. It's not just about comfort, it's about health. Because if you screw this up even just once, you're looking at a whole new level of misery. So let's talk about moss. Not just as a desperate wipe, but as a toilet paper substitute used by medieval people across Europe, especially in forested regions. Not all moss is created equal. Some species are scratchy, acidic, or full of tiny bugs. But sphagnum moss, that's the good stuff. Soft, absorbent, and naturally antibacterial. In some places, it was even used to dress wounds in battlefields well into the 20th century. That's right, butt wipe and bandage in one humble plant. You carefully finish your business, stand and take a moment to appreciate that, at the very least, you didn't have to use bark this time. Or snow. Or that one regrettable attempt with dried thistle that you still think about during quiet moments. You bury your waste in a small trench just like you're supposed to, cover it with soil and mark it with a twig. Not because you're coming back to it, but because you've learned the hard way that wandering around barefoot without a plan leads to consequences. Back at camp, you scrub your hands with ash and water, grateful for your homemade soap. You're running low, but a little goes a long way. And yes, it still smells like old bacon and regret. But right now, you're more interested in hygiene than fragrance. The soap stings a small cut on your palm and you welcome it. Pain means it's working, right? You start thinking about latrines. You've been avoiding the idea, but the time has come. If you're serious about staying out here long term, and let's face it, you've gone full moss wipe, you need a real solution. A designated spot. Dug deep, far from your water source, downwind from camp, and easy to reach in the dark without tripping over a stump and painting the forest floor with your dignity. You dig the pit slowly. The soil is stiff with frost, but breaks easier than you expected once you're down a foot. You carve out a rectangle deep enough that you won't fill it for weeks, maybe longer. Then you build up the sides with flat stones and lay a plank across the top, a little nod to comfort in this increasingly uncomfortable life. You add a modest screen of woven branches for privacy and mark the path with notched sticks so you can find it even during a midnight emergency. And just like that, you've got yourself a midden, a word that sounds fancy but really just means the designated poop zone. Medieval households had them, even castles. They weren't glamorous, but they worked. You knew where the waste went, and more importantly, where it didn't. Here's the part people forget. Sanitation was a survival skill. Maybe the survival skill. You could build a fortress, grow a perfect garden, stockpile smoked meat, but one badly managed latrine and you're knee-deep in dysentery. Medieval cities learned that the hard way, and so did rural villages. That's why they kept waste far from wells, built drainage trenches, and even scheduled communal clean-outs. Some towns even employed designated gong farmers to haul away the nastier bits. A job that paid decently well if you could stand the smell and didn't mind working under cover of darkness so your neighbours didn't faint at the sight of you. There's still debate among scholars about how widespread sanitation efforts really were. Some argue that the average medieval peasant just did their business in the woods and left it at that. Others point to well-constructed pits, organised waste systems, and clear signs of regular maintenance in excavated village sites. The truth is probably somewhere in between, messy but not clueless. You think about all this as you stand back and admire your new latrine like it's a cathedral. It's a hole in the ground, but it's your hole in the ground, clean, contained, and way more organised than your current food system. Later you collect more moss, carefully this time. You lay it out to dry near the fire, turning it like laundry. You know it won't stay good for long once it's dry, but it's still better than grabbing random leaves in the dark and praying they aren't poison ivy. You also experiment with bundles of soft grass, wrapping them into little torches of absorbency, just in case the moss supply runs low. It's gross work, it's necessary work, and weirdly, you find yourself proud of it. Because this is real survival, not dramatic, not glamorous, just quiet competence in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. As night falls, you light your fire and sit with your hands extended toward the warmth, your body aching from labour, your stomach rumbling, but your camp a little more human, a little more livable. You think back to the comfort of indoor plumbing, white tiles, scented candles, and softly humming fans. Then you look at your muddy latrine pit, your moss stockpile, and your clean hands, A nod. You've built something. And it's weird and selly and kind of glorious. You wake to the sound of something chewing. Not loudly, no cracking bones or dramatic horror film crunching. Just a steady, moist slurp slurp somewhere near the edge of camp. You freeze. It's still dark out, the faintest hint of dawn smearing the sky in grey, and the fire's nothing but a sighing ember. You reach for your knife, your back still stiff from yesterday's latrine-digging glory, and inch toward the sound. It's a deer, a young one, staring at your bundled-up rushes like it's just discovered salad. The moment you shift your weight, it bolts, disappearing into the trees in one smooth, effortless bounce. And just like that, it's gone, leaving behind a few hoofprints and a deep, gnawing ache in your gut. Not because you wanted to kill it, but because you just watched your emergency kindling supply become someone's breakfast. Welcome to the Foraging Mindset Medieval Edition. You're not the only one trying to survive out here. Everything wants to eat, and the rules are simple. If you're not quick, clever, or cautious, you're last in line. You sigh, poke at the fire, and decide to make today about learning what's edible that no one else seems interested in. The leftovers, the overlooked, the things you used to mow down or swear at while hiking. That means digging into the fine art of foraging like a peasant, with all the risks, rewards, and regret that entails. You start with nettles. They've become your comfort food out here, which says a lot about how your standards have shifted. But they're everywhere, especially in disturbed soil near your shelter, and they're packed with vitamins and iron. You use gloves this time, thankfully, and cut a few young tops, the tender kind that don't bite back as hard. Later you'll boil them into a soup, maybe even mix them with acorn flour for what can loosely be described as pancakes if you close your eyes and use your imagination. Then you spot something new, cleavers, sticky green plants that cling to your clothes like they're desperate for affection. Peasants used to steep them for liver health, but you're more interested in their role as a salad green. Raw, they taste like the inside of a hay bale, but they go down easier with a splash of vinegar, if you had vinegar, which you don't. Still, they're edible, they're free, and they haven't been chewed on by forest freeloaders yet. You add them to your basket along with some chickweed, which you're about 70% sure is chickweed, and not something designed to kill you in 48 hours. That's the fun of foraging. Every bite is a trustful with nature, and medieval peasants didn't have field guides or apps. They had experience passed down through family lines, oral tradition, and a few spectacularly bad mistakes along the way. There's an old rule among foragers: if in doubt, leave it out. You repeat that mantra as you eye a cluster of mushrooms growing from a rotten log. They're brown, they're gilled, they're probably fine, but probably doesn't mean much when your only toilet is a trench and your health insurance plan is a mint leaf and a stick. You back away and pretend you never saw them. Here's where things get interesting. You realise that true foraging isn't just about knowing what to eat, it's about knowing when to eat it. Timing is everything. Nettles before they flower, acorns after they've leached. Dandelion leaves early in the season when they're mild, not bitter. The medieval peasant knew this because their life depended on it. 1 week could be the difference between food and poison, or at least between edible and, I hate this but I'm eating it anyway. You spend most of the day walking, eyes on the ground, hands brushing through weeds with a kind of reverence. You don't see trash anymore, you see potential meals. The peasant mindset is taking root. You pass by a patch of dock and recognise the tall seed stalks as something you could grind into a flour. You spot wild garlic and your heart skips a beat. You find a single, shriveled crabapple and treat it like treasure. By afternoon, your pouch is full of things you wouldn't have looked twice at back in the world of grocery stores. Now they're your pantry. And the pride you feel is ridiculous. You didn't shoot anything, you didn't skin a rabbit, but you found food. Quietly, carefully, thoughtfully. That's a victory. Back at camp, you boil the nettles with a handful of wild garlic and a few crushed burdock roots. The flavour is earthy, sharp, a little metallic, but it fills your stomach and makes you feel real, grounded, like you're part of the ecosystem now, not just a trespasser, a participant. And here's your fringe fact of the day. During famines, some medieval communities kept hunger gardens, plots of wild edibles cultivated quietly near homes or monasteries. Things that weren't cash crops, things that didn't feed armies, just quiet little foods that survived when nothing else did. Lamb's quarters, mallow, wild mustard, stuff you'd ignore unless you were desperate, and then you'd bless its existence. There's debate, of course. Some historians argue that most peasants didn't rely heavily on foraging, that they preferred cultivated foods and only ate wild things when absolutely necessary. Others insist that casual, low-level foraging was constant, part of daily life, not just crisis mode. Judging by your stomach, you're siding with the latter. As evening settles in, you sip the last of your soup and feel, if not full, then not hollow. The wind rustles the reeds around your shelter, and you glance out at the trees with new eyes. Not threats, not mysteries, just shelves, living shelves, holding calories that don't advertise themselves. You just have to know how to look. Tomorrow you'll search for sorrel, maybe find some rose hips if the deer haven't stripped them. You might even try roasting those dock seeds. But for now, you curl up beside the fire, wrapped in the smell of garlic, smoke, and triumph. You didn't hunt, you didn't gather in force, you foraged. And you're still alive. The air feels different this morning, sharper, almost electric. You notice it as soon as you step outside, the fine hairs on your arms rising in a quiet chorus of awareness. The trees are still, the birds are silent, and above you the sky is layered in heavy grey wool, like it's bracing for something, maybe a storm, maybe worse. You tighten your cloak and scan the tree line with more suspicion than usual. Something about today is off. And it's the perfect day to test one of the oldest, strangest communication systems known to pre-modern man, medieval smoke signals. No one thinks about signalling in survival anymore. Everyone's obsessed with food, fire, and a shelter, rightfully so, but communication, that's a luxury in most prepper guides. Out here, though, in a place where you are truly deeply alone, the idea of sending a message or receiving one feels a little less ridiculous, especially if things go wrong, especially if you're being watched. You've been thinking about this for a while, ever since you spotted that ridge half a day's walk south, the one that sits higher than the trees and has a clear line of sight to another hill on the opposite side of the valley. You can't stop wondering if anyone's up there. A traveller, a hermit, a survivor like you, maybe just a hawk. But maybe not. You wouldn't see them through the trees, not without light, but a signal, that travels. So today, you prep. You gather green leaves, damp moss and wet pine needles, things that make thick white smoke when thrown on a fire. Then you find drier wood, soft bark and dry grasses for your base fuel. You bundle it all into your pack and set off toward the ridge, knife on your belt, stick in hand. You feel like a messenger, or a spy, or a medieval field technician trying to tech someone using fire and vibes. The climb is slow but steady. The cold wind cuts through the trees in little fits, but the snow hasn't started yet, and the clouds are holding. When you reach the top, you're rewarded with a view that feels like a secret. Hills and trees stretch endlessly, and for a second, you imagine what it would be like to see someone on the opposite hill send up a plume of smoke, to know you're not alone, to know they saw you. You set the fire carefully, building a flat base and piling kindling in a cone. You keep the green material off to the side for now. Once the fire's hot, that's when you'll make the smoke. You light it with flint and steel, coaxing it into life, the wind catching your first few sparks and threatening to undo your effort. But it catches, slowly, carefully, until the flame builds and you're ready. You toss on the green branches. They hiss and crackle, smoke billowing up in thick, slow curls. You add more, regulating the fire so it doesn't burn too hot and eat the smoke. It takes a few tries. Too much dry wood and the fire burns clean. Too much wet stuff and it chokes. But after a while, you get it. Tall, white columns of smoke rising like a question into the sky. Then you stop and wait. And this is where the real medieval weirdness begins. Because smoke signals weren't random, they were coded. Simple sequences, yes, but meaningful. 2 short plumes might mean I'm here. 1 long, 1 short. Danger. 3 in a row. Come now. The actual meanings varied by region, group and need. But the method was consistent. Fire, fuel, rhythm. Some historians argue that signal fires like this were used in medieval Europe to warn of invasions, Viking raids, enemy movements, even spreading disease. There are records of watch beacons lit along ridges, miles apart, each one visible to the next. In theory, you could relay a message across counties in hours, long before any rider could make the journey. Others believe it was more of a military thing, used by scouts or forward camps to alert the main force. Either way, the technology was simple but powerful: light, smoke, pattern, and trust that someone was watching. You send 3 bursts, 1, 2, 3, then nothing. Just the wind, the smoke curling above you, and the quiet crackle of your fire. You sit there for what feels like forever, eyes locked on the opposing hill, the clouds thickening above you, your stomach twisting in that strange mix of hope and logic. Hope that someone will answer. Logic that says, no one will. And then, movement. No smoke, not yet, just a flicker, a dark shape, a shadow that shifts against the pale sky. Too far to be clear, too real to be your imagination. You stare unmoving, heart in your throat, and for a moment, just one, you are sure that someone is there. But no signal comes, the shadow disappears. Maybe a bird, maybe not. You throw one more green branch on the fire, watch it puff thickly, then let it burn down. The smoke rises slower now, less purposeful, curling into a question mark before thinning into nothing. No response. But you feel different. Not disappointed, not exactly. Connected. Even without an answer, you've reminded the world you exist. You wait until the fire burns down to ash before burying the coals. You scatter the stones, wipe away the traces. If someone is out there, you've made your move. They know where to find you now, or they know to stay away. You return to camp in the cold, the wind picking up behind you, pushing your cloak tight against your back. The fire inside your hut is low, but it welcomes you like an old friend. You sit, warm your hands, and think about the ridge, about signals, about being seen, and maybe, just maybe, being seen is half the battle. The snow finally falls that night. Slow at first, like the sky is second-guessing itself, then harder, heavier, relentless. You wake to silence, a strange, muffled quiet that only comes when the world is wrapped in white. Every sound is padded. Every breath feels sharper. Your hut groans gently under the weight, but holds, thanks to the sod roof and layers of thatch you crammed into the cracks with frozen fingers 2 weeks ago. You're grateful for every muddy handful. You crawl from your bed of crushed reeds and marsh hay, groggy and stiff, and open the door just enough to look out. The landscape is unrecognizable, smooth, blank, untouched. The fence you built is half buried. The path to your snare lines is gone, and your latrine, may it rest in peace beneath the drift. But there's something else, a stink, not from the outside, from beneath, from inside the camp. You follow your nose to the far corner of the hut, and there it is, the midden pit, or what used to be the pit. Now it's full, frozen at the edges, but sludgy in the middle, and you realise with horror that you've waited too long. What began as a clever waste system has reached critical mass. It's leaking, slowly, steadily, into your living space. Time to act. No more ignoring it. No more I'll dig it deeper later. Today is sanitation day, and that means gloves, a shovel, and a strong stomach. Welcome to the medieval science of human waste management, the least discussed, most important survival topic there is. You bundle up and head outside, crossing the snow-covered clearing to dig a new midden, farther from the hut on higher ground with better drainage. The ground is half frozen and full of roots, but you work methodically, hacking through the soil with a short-handled spade and your usual stubbornness. It takes the better part of the morning to dig something deep enough to last through winter, but when you're done, you line the pit with stones and snow, then cover the base with ash, just like medieval folks did. Ash wasn't just for soap or teeth or fire starters, it was also a deodorizer, a disinfectant, and a barrier between you and future diseases. Tossing ash into your latrine helped keep flies down, smells down, and pathogens from climbing out and ruining your entire week. It's medieval bleach, and you've got plenty. You use your spade to shift the worst of the mess from the old pit into the new one, burying it layer by layer with snow, dirt, and ash. It's gruesome work, and more than once you gag hard enough to see stars, but you get it done. You seal the new pit with a reed mat and make a mental note to start a rotation system, just like the old villagers did. One pit in use, one sealed, one resting. The cycle of survival painted in brown. You build a small windbreak around the new midden, using sticks and a few spare hide scraps to shield it from snow and nosy animals. The wind howls over the hilltop, and you tug your cloak tighter around your shoulders, wondering what you would have done if the pit had burst in the middle of the night, or in the middle of your floor. Back inside, you wash your hands with hot water, ash, and what's left of your strong soap. Your skin burns from the scrubbing, but it's worth it. You think about medieval families living in one-room cottages, huddled together with their animals, their waste stored in chamber pots under the bed until someone could dump it out the window or carry it to the village pit. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked most of the time. Here's a strange fact. In larger towns and monasteries, medieval sanitation could be surprisingly advanced. Latrines flushed by streams, multi-level waste channels, even cesspits with wooden seats and ventilation shafts. Monks kept detailed schedules for cleaning them, not because they were obsessed with neatness, but because they had to be. One infection could sweep through a cloister like wildfire. Cleanliness wasn't virtue, it was strategy. Of course, not everyone agrees on how widespread these methods were. Some historians argue that outside major centres, peasants mostly went in the woods and left it at that. Others point to clear archaeological evidence, layered pits, waste-specific tools, and even preserved parasite eggs to show that medieval folk were more sanitation savvy than we give them credit for. Either way, they were dealing with the same problem you are: what to do with what you leave behind. You set aside an old stick for stirring the ash barrel and cut a groove in the snow from your hut to the new pit. A trough path designed to stay clear, obvious, and safe to follow even in whiteout conditions. You mark it with reed flags tied to upright stakes. It looks ridiculous. It's also incredibly effective. By late afternoon, the wind has picked up, driving snow barrows across the clearing. You seal the door and settle back into your hut, the fire roaring again, your clothes drying on a rack above the coals. The smell is gone, the threat is gone, and for the first time in days, your camp feels livable again. You lie back on your reed mat, the scratchy cloak pulled to your chin, and listen to the wind circle your shelter like a curious animal. Everything feels quieter now, not peaceful, just sanitary. You glance toward your bucket of snow water, toward the ash barrel, toward the newly dug pit outside, and nod. It's not glorious work. No one writes songs about clean latrines and clever drainage, but in a world where you can't afford a single misstep, these are the victories that matter. And tomorrow, if the storm lets up, you'll dig a trench around the hut for runoff. Maybe even carve a drainage spout. Because survival isn't just about food and fire, it's about controlling the things no one wants to talk about. And now your camp doesn't stink. And that's something to be proud of. You've had the same dream for 3 nights now. A bird with a black beak and deep human eyes. It walks beside you in a city made of stone and fog, whispering things you don't understand. When you wake, there's always a bitter taste in your mouth and a faint, sharp throb behind your eyes. You're not sick exactly, but your head is heavy, your thoughts are fogged, and your fire, no matter how bright, can't seem to cut the cold the way it used to. You rub your eyes and sit up slowly, listening to the wind gnawing at your shelter. It's colder again, deeper, like the frost is learning your name. And while you're not one to buy into the whole omen thing, you can't shake the feeling that you're being warned. So today, with a knot in your chest and that dream bird still hovering somewhere in your skull, you decide to face the myth head on. It's time to talk about the plague mask, that long-beaked, nightmare-fueled icon of medieval horror, and the truth behind what people really did during outbreaks. Because if you're going to cough your way through winter, you may as well do it with historical context. You remember the mask from books, from films, from Halloween displays. Long leather beak, black robes, gloved hands. The plague doctor, the closest thing to death in a cloak and hat. But out here in the cold and dirt, without costume shops or cosplay forums, you start thinking about what that outfit really was. Function, not fashion. You try to make one, just to see how ridiculous it feels. You take a bit of boiled leather, shape it into a crude cone, sew it to a hood using gut thread and more determination than skill. You stuff the beak with pine needles, mint, and a chunk of dried yarrow. Anything you think might block out foul air. You put it on, and it's awful. Claustrophobic, heavy, smells like old socks and crushed plants. Your breath condenses on the inside and drips back into your mouth. But it kind of works. Your nose doesn't sting when you clean out the midden. The cold doesn't bite quite as hard. For a moment you get it. The logic, even if the science was wobbly. Medieval people weren't dumb, they knew disease moved. They didn't know how, but they had theories. Miasma, the idea that sickness came from bad air, was the big one. So those plague beaks. They were basically air filters, packed with herbs and soaked cloth meant to protect the wearer. It didn't always work, of course, because the problem wasn't the smell, it was the fleas and bacteria, and the fact that cities were crowded cesspools where everyone shared walls, food and lice. But here's the twist. Most actual peasants never wore plague masks. Those belonged to wealthy government-employed plague doctors, Men who were paid hazard wages to walk the streets, tally the dead, lance buboes, and occasionally perform bloodletting or forced isolation. You, a humble medieval survivor, would have had something very different. You would have burned herbs in your home, probably carried a bundle of dried sage or rue at your hip, maybe stuffed lavender into the cracks of your shelter. You might have worn a scarf soaked in vinegar over your face or chewed garlic cloves raw. You would have scrubbed down surfaces with vinegar, buried your sick out back and prayed, loudly and often. There's still debate among historians about how effective these methods were. Some argue that mass herbal burning actually helped reduce certain airborne pathogens. Others say it was placebo at best. But what's clear is this: when the plague hit, people did something. They reacted, adapted, whether that meant cleaning more, isolating themselves, or abandoning entire towns. You try some of those remedies now, more out of curiosity than necessity. You boil a pot of vinegar and rosemary over the fire until the hut smells like a salad on fire. You press hot cloths soaked in sage tea to your face and breathe deep. You hang bundles of dried garlic from the doorframe, not because you think they'll help, but because they feel like they might. And you remember that this was the line between life and death for so many. Not certainty, just trying things, taking steps, grasping at whatever made the danger feel smaller, more manageable, more human. Outside, the snow deepens. The trees are pale and brittle under the weight. You walk the perimeter of your camp with your plague mask on, which looks more like a haunted duck than a medieval doctor, and you laugh. For the first time in days, you laugh. It's stupid, it's ugly, it fogs up your vision and freezes the tip of your nose. But you made it. You made this absurd thing, and now you're parading around like a paranoid crow scaring deer and muttering about miasmas. Inside the hut, you remove the mask and hang it near the fire to dry. Your breath comes easier now, not because of the herbs probably, but because you're warm, hydrated, and finally allowing yourself to rest. You sip yarrow tea and chew on a roasted burdock root, and for the first time you don't feel helpless. Because the truth about medieval plague response isn't just about masks and myths. It's about people doing their best in a terrifying world, often without answers, often without hope, but still trying, still fighting, still surviving, just like you. And that, maybe, is the real legacy of the plague mask, not the leather, not the herbs, not the fear, but the refusal to give up. The insistence on building something between you and the darkness, even if it's stitched together from scraps and superstition. Tomorrow you'll take the mask apart, reuse the leather for something better. But tonight, you sleep with the herb still burning faintly in the fire pit, the vinegar simmering in its pot, and the scent of survival thick in the air. The wind shifts again, this time carrying something you haven't felt in weeks. Warmth. Not heat exactly, not the kind that makes your bones sing, but a whisper of change. A soft breath that brushes across your skin as you lean out of your shelter. You sniff the air and taste water, melting snow trickling somewhere far off in the trees. And just like that, it clicks. Winter is loosening its grip. It's not done with you, not by a long shot, but it's stumbling. The days are longer. The birds have started making noise again. The forest is creaking back to life. You should be celebrating. You should be laughing and dancing in the snowmelt, yelling into the thawing trees about how you made it, how you survived the deep freeze and the hunger and the solitude. But you don't, because instead you're thinking about what comes next. The medieval mind wasn't built for survival alone, it was built for rhythm. The steady beat of seasons, the rise and fall of work, feast and famine. Survival was just the beginning. Rebuilding came after. So you decide it's time to clean the slate. Not metaphorically, literally. Today you clean everything, the tools, the pots, the bedding, the mats, even your shelter. Because in the medieval world, the shift from winter to spring wasn't just a slow thaw, it was a reckoning. They called it cleansing time, and it meant something. You start with your cloak. The poor thing has absorbed every smell, stain and nightmare from the past 3 months. You drag it down to the stream, which is barely liquid, and beat it against a flat rock like a medieval laundry witch. The water bites your hands, makes your knuckles swell, but you scrub it anyway. Soap, sand and determination. You do the same for your linen underlayer, your wool trousers, your rag-stitched hood. One by one, you wash them all. Not because you're vain, but because you're done carrying winter's dirt into spring. You dry the clothes on a rack beside the fire and start scrubbing your shelter next. Smoke has blackened the walls. The bedding reeks of sweat and swamp and smoke. You pull everything out, Mats, bedding, rushes, gear, and hang what you can. The rest gets burned or buried. You sweep the floor clean with a bundle of birch twigs, then sprinkle ash and crushed mint to chase out the lingering stink. It smells like work. Like change. Back in the medieval day, this kind of cleansing wasn't optional. It was tied to religion, sure, Lent and all that. But it was also practical. Rats came with the melt, so did lice. And rot. If you didn't clean, you got sick. If you didn't reset the home, the spring wasn't a blessing. It was a fresh wave of misery. Monks wrote about scrubbing floors with vinegar and herbs. Farmhands rebuilt their straw beds. Even nobles aired out their grand halls and whitewashed the walls. It wasn't luxury. It was defence. And there's something oddly sacred about it. You've been wallowing in the same rot for months, and now, as you lift a mouldy basket and throw it into the fire, you feel lighter, not cleaner, just less burdened. Like maybe there's room now for something better. You move to your tools, your knife dulled from splitting bark and bone, your fire striker blackened from use, your cooking pot crusted with 1,000 nettle stews. You scrub them with sand and snow, polish them with your cloak and line them up like soldiers. You sharpen your blade slowly, the sound of metal on stone whispering promises, food, wood, defence, the simple things, and while you clean you talk, to yourself, to the tools, to the space, just like they would have. In medieval households, talking while working wasn't strange. It was expected. Songs, prayers, stories, instructions to no one in particular, because words filled the gaps that silence tried to invade. They reminded you who you were, that you hadn't disappeared, that this cold season hadn't swallowed you whole. You tell your knife it's still your best friend. You thank your pot for not cracking. You apologise to your soap for all the insults. It's silly, it's ridiculous, and it helps. By midday, the place looks different. Still rough, still smoky, but new somehow, like a field after harvest. Empty but ready. You even hang up a bundle of mint and yarrow by the door, something to make it feel less like a burrow and more like a home. You eat lunch outside, just a thin broth with crushed acorn and dried garlic. But the sun is hitting your face and there's dripping somewhere behind you. A steady, slow plink of meltwater. You sip and listen and exhale. And here's your last fringe fact of the night. Some medieval villages practiced a ritual called the beating of the bounds when winter ended. They'd walk the edges of their territory, children included, and literally beat the boundary markers with sticks to remind the land and the people of where they belonged. It wasn't punishment. It was memory work. Reclaiming the shape of your life after months of survival. You like that. So you walk the edge of your camp before sundown, touch your traps, check your smoke rack, kick the base of your fence, whisper to the trees. You leave footprints in the softening snow, and for the first time, you don't dread what comes next. You've built, you've endured, and now, as the season shifts, you mark your bounds. This is your space, this is your story, and you're still here to tell it. The fire is low now, just a flicker behind your closed eyes. The logs are mostly coals, soft orange breathing into the darkness, and your limbs are wrapped tight beneath your cloak, your back against the packed earth. The air finally still. You hear the last drip of snow melt off the edge of your roof, a rhythm like a clock, slow and steady, but quieter now. Everything has quieted. You made it. Somehow you made it. There's no feast waiting, no grand fanfare, but the silence feels earned. The tools are cleaned, the midden pit is managed, the water is drinkable, and your bed, still scratchy, still a little damp around the edges, is a throne compared to what it was weeks ago. You've come so far you can't even see the beginning from here. You close your eyes and think about the first nights, when the cold was a predator and hunger gnawed at your ribs, when you were chewing moss and hoping it didn't fight back, when your traps were empty, your soup was brown water, and your hands trembled every time the wind shifted. It's not gone, not entirely, but it doesn't own you now. You've learned the land, its shadows, its secrets. Somewhere out there the deer still watch you, the roots still grow under snow, the trees still whisper to each other in creaks and groans. But they've accepted you, in their way. You've adapted to the old rhythms, those forgotten medieval techniques that were never really gone, just buried under centuries of convenience. You smell of smoke and garlic. Your fingers are calloused. Your mind is sharp. You know how to catch a fish with string and desperation. You know which moss to trust, which bark to grind into a sad, dusty bread, how to store water, how to keep the rats out, how to signal to a stranger across a valley. You didn't just survive, you relearned a forgotten world. One meal, one mistake, one aching night at a time. So now you breathe, just for a little while. Let the cold roll off your shoulders, let the aches ease into the ground. No alarms, no buzzing, no headlines. Just the sound of your own breath in the dark and the faint rustle of bracken overhead. If someone had told you back in the warm world that this was what survival looked like, not movie heroics, not crossbows and canned beans, but soap made from ashes and beds made from reeds, you'd have laughed. But you know now, the truth is quieter, dirtier, kinder. You're tired, but it's the good kind. The kind that means you earned your sleep. So let the wind hum at your door like an old friend. Let the coals burn down to memory. Let the moss cradle your head and the mint scent of the hut remind you, you did it. You walked through the oldest fears with the oldest tools, and you're still here. The past is alive in you now, not in books, not in songs, in practice. Tomorrow maybe you'll boil new roots, sharpen your blade, test the traps, but tonight you sleep, you earned this.